deuxième TV, la diaspora s'exprime.
Bonsoir. Mesdames, Mesdemoiselles et Messieurs, nous revoilà. Après un... Narcisse, je peux y aller? Après un long...
Tu es en direct depuis le générique.
Ah, désolé. Voilà, donc mesdames, mesdemoiselles, messieurs, comme je disais, d'abord, nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue sur notre chaîne de NTV dans l'émission Tamery. Nous revoilà après un long moment d'absence dû à l'épidémie du Covid. Nous revoilà sur des MTV dans notre émission Tamery où nous allons à rebrousse-poil contre toute l'actualité et surtout la géopolitique et la géostratégie. Alors, nous avons ici ce soir, nous allons parler du cas de l'Éthiopie et ce qui s'y passe depuis plusieurs années. Pour nos éditeurs ouest-africains, nous souhaitons expliquer la crise récente en Éthiopie et en Érythrée et comment elle représente plusieurs similitudes avec une autre crise dans l'ouest de l'Afrique, celle de la Côte d'Ivoire. Cette émission portera sur la guerre hybride que le Tpfl, excusez-moi, le Front de libération du peuple du Tigré, parti cléopâtrique au pouvoir en Éthiopie depuis 1991 à 2018, et ses alliés, ceux qui ont exercé au cours de ces 3 dernières décennies dans la région de l'Éthiopie, de l'Érythrée et au-delà, ainsi que leur implication récente dans la guerre qui a commencé en novembre 2020. Nous ferons de brèves comparaisons entre la guerre d'Éthiopie, entre le Tplf et le gouvernement éthiopien d'Abiy Ahmed, avec la crise qui a frappé la Côte d'Ivoire de 2002 à 2022. Nous aborderons les différents aspects de cette guerre hybride, les rebelles par procuration, la diplomatie trompeuse, les soutiens militaires, les médias et les ONG utilisés comme outils de désinformation, les opérations psychologiques, ainsi que l'instrumentalisation des agences internationales dont l'ONU. Nous parlerons également des menaces en cours et nous parlerons aussi du massacre qui se passe en ce moment dans les régions Amhara et Afar, que nous pourrions que ces massacres dans ces 2 régions, Amhara et Afar, pourraient être qualifiés de massacres de masse. Alors, ce soir, nous avons 2 invités, et pas les moindres. Nous avons la politologue et activiste Aster Carpenelli, basée à Rome, et le chercheur, journaliste et rédacteur en chef de Horn of Africa TV, Elias Amare, basé aux États-Unis, en Californie précisément. Voilà. Alors, Nikki, la parole est à toi pour l'introduction en anglais.
Bonsoir, bonsoir nos invités. Donc, on va faire de français-anglais, mais ça va être une traduction simultanée. Donc, plus tard, dans une deuxième temps, on veut aussi faire une traduction voice-over qui va être plus précis. Je pose la question en anglais à mes 2 invités et Pierrette va traduire.
Ima.
A blueprint for destabilizing countries in Africa, often applied by Western powers, is the use of an armed rebellion, a proxy group whose sole purpose is to bring about regime change in the country that's targeted. In the case of Ivory Coast, this group was called the Force Nouvelle, headed by Guillaume Soro, a group which actually sprung from nowhere, had no following in the country, was trained and backed by France and Burkina Faso, and pretended even to be 3 different fractions, covering different parts of the country. The so-called Force Nouvelle instrumentalized ethnic grievances to justify a coup d'etat. On the 19th of September 2002, the country was split in 2, leaving the north occupied for 8 years under a rebellion. This is a terrible event in the memory of Ivorians, where even the interior minister, Émile Bogoudodou, has lost his life. This can be compared to the Tplf attack on the 3rd of November 2020 in Tigra, Ethiopia. Before describing this attack, we need, however, to give some background on who the Tplf is in Ethiopian and Eritrean history. So I just want to ask Esther, before we answer the question, what is the Tplf and what does it represent in recent Ethiopian history? Maybe to also give us an idea of the rich ethnic diversity that Ethiopia houses, which is very, very similar to Ivory Coast, which also has 60 ethnic groups. We just have quickly a translation of the question in French, and then we move to you.
Yes. Aster Carpenelli. Yes. Que représente le TPLF dans l'histoire éthiopienne?
Okay, good evening, everybody. Ethiopia is a multi-ethnic nation. It has around 84 ethnic groups. Among these ethnic groups, the major ethnic groups are the Oromos, Amhara, Tigray. The Oromos and the Amharas alone make up of 60% of the Ethiopian population. Regarding Tplf, Tplf has played a very crucial role in the Ethiopian politics, beginning from the 1970s. Actually, the genesis of the Tplf, we can trace it back to the student movement of the 1960s. We remember that the Ethiopian student movement of Addis Ababa University started its struggle in the 60s against the Ethiopian feudal system, against the aristocracy and the monarchy that was present in Ethiopia in that period of time. The Ethiopian student movement was actually, in the beginning, it was a national movement. And then later on, gradually, it started assuming a leftist ideology, especially the Marxist-Leninist ideology. After the downfall of Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974, there were different political groups in Ethiopia. Just to mention a few, there was the EPRP, which is the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party. There was the Ma'ison, All Ethiopian Socialist Movement, and then there was the EDU. EDU was the Ethiopian Democratic Union, and on the other hand, there was the Tplf. All of these political entities had a common goal, in a sense that they were struggling against the military dictatorship led by Mengistu Haile Mariam. Among these groups, the Tplf was actually founded in 1975. These four groups had similarities and differences among them. For example, if we take Ma'ison, the Tplf and EPRP had similarities as they were somehow leftist political groups, whereas on the other hand, the EDU was a conservative party. On the other hand, whereas EPRP, Ma'ison, and EDU were national parties because their struggle for liberating the whole of Ethiopian people, whereas PPLF's political objective was regardless solely Tigray, which at that time was one of the provinces of Ethiopia. Even if we see the name itself, PPLF, Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, so shows clearly that it is an ethnocentric and ethno-nationalist group. The rest of the groups gradually disappeared from the political scene of Ethiopia, but Tplf continued with its struggle, and one of the important political events of the 1970s is the political manifesto of Tplf. This political manifesto has some important points that, according to me, we have to mention. And some of these points are, number one, in this manifesto, the Tplf clearly states that who are the Tigrayans or the Tigrayan people. For Tplf, according to its manifesto, Tigrawai, as they say, it are all people who live within the province of Tigray. Moreover, all Tigray-speaking people or population outside the Tigray are also Tigrawai or Tigrayans. This includes Tigrayan-speaking population in Amhara region, as well as Tigrayan-speaking population in Eritrea. And this is directly connected with the objective of Tplf in annexing some of the territories in Amhara region, as well as some territories or some part of Eritrea, in order to create what is to be known as the Greater Tigray, the state of the Greater Tigray. And the second point in this manifesto is it clearly designated the Amhara people as the #1 enemy of all nationalities in Ethiopia. In fact, they stated that the Amhara ethnic group is the dominant group in Ethiopia, and it has dominated for centuries the other nationalities from the political, economic, and political view. Hence, in this Tplf's manifesto, the Amhara people were already targeted as the enemies of all nationalities living in Ethiopia. These are some of the points written in the manifesto of the Tplf. The Tplf then gradually started strengthening itself from the point of view, from the economic point of view, from the political point of view, and at the end of the 1980s, it was able to liberate some territories, important cities like Aksum. How did the Tplf get this strength, this political and military strength? One of the tactics of the Tplf was using the humanitarian aid that international donor organizations donated to Ethiopia. They formed different types of non-governmental organizations. For example, I remember one of them is REST. These non-governmental organizations actually were not non-governmental. They were directly or indirectly controlled by the Tplf, by the Central Committee of the Tplf. During the 70s, for example, international humanitarian organizations donated around $1 billion American to the Ethiopian people. This aid was diverted by the Tplf through its NGOs and the Tplf used this humanitarian aid to gain the support of the Tigrayan people. Supporters of the political aim of Tplf used to get some kind of aid. On the other hand, it used the humanitarian aid to buy weapons. Moreover, it also used this humanitarian aid to open small businesses. In the 70s and in the 80s, the Tplf was able to open small businesses, especially in the Sudan. By doing this, and moreover, by taxing the people in the territories where it occupied, it gained much more economic strength. It also, for example, confiscated any kind of financial resources when it occupied or was able to liberate new territories. In this way, by the end of the 1980s, Tplf became militarily and economically a strong organization. And as we know, the Tplf was finally able to come to power in Ethiopia by 1991. Moreover, Tplf also has prepared itself to govern Ethiopia by forming some ethnic groups as political parties around itself. For example, we could mention the OPDO, Oromo People's Democratic Organization. We could mention the Amhara Democratic Movement and the Southern Ethiopian People's Democratic Front. All these organizations were somehow created or supported by the Tplf, and when it came to power, we remember that it formed a coalition. The coalition included these political groups which were organized on ethnic lines. When it came to power in 1991, Tplf gradually realized some of its objectives that was described or clearly written in its manifesto of 1976. In fact, one of the things that the political things that the Tplf did when it came to power in Ethiopia was the drafting and promulgating the Ethiopian constitution, federal constitution. Ethiopia still is governed by this constitution, which was promulgated, drafted and promulgated by Tplf in 1994. If we see the Ethiopian constitution, I would say that even now it is a major cause of political turmoil and instability in Ethiopia. If we look at the constitution, for example, at the preamble of the constitution, in the preamble of the Ethiopian constitution, it's written that Ethiopia is a sum of nationalities, nations, and peoples. And Article 39 of the Ethiopian constitution openly recognizes the right to self-determination of nations' nationalities in Ethiopia up to secession. This is the constitution that is governing Ethiopia still now. Moreover, when it came to power, one of the first things that the Tplf did was realizing somehow its dream of creating Greater Tigray. For example, it took some territories from the Amhara region, like Raya and Wolkite. Before 1991, Wolkite and Raya territories have always been part of the Amhara region. But after it came to power, it took these territories and annexed it to the Tigrayan region. Moreover, it divided Ethiopia into 9 ethnic regions. For example, the Amhara region, the Afar region, the Oromo region, the Somali region, and so on. And now, after some years, after even the Tplf is not in power, the number of regions in Ethiopia has augmented, has increased. We have around 11 regions now. These regions are not only simply autonomous. Each and every region in Ethiopia acts as an independent state. Each and every region in Ethiopia has its own special forces, highly trained and highly armed special forces. Moreover, when it governed Ethiopia, the Tplf, even if there was a coalition, the coalition, I didn't mention it before, the EPRDF, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, even if Ethiopia was governed by this coalition, the dominant political party in that coalition was the Tplf. And Tplf practically controlled all aspects of social, economic, and political life in Ethiopia. For example, if we take the security apparatus in Ethiopia, it was practically controlled by the Tplf. The military, national military, the defense force in Ethiopia was controlled by the Tplf. If we see the list of the names of the Ethiopian national defense when the Tplf was in power, we could see that most of the generals and higher officials of the military were come from Tigray region. everything in Ethiopia was under the domination of the Tplf. If we say during the rule of Tplf, for example, in Ethiopia, there was no right of the Ethiopians didn't have the right to express their views, their political views openly, because the media also was controlled by the Tplf. For example, the Ethiopian Broadcasting Corporation was under the control of the Tplf. Even the internet service in Ethiopia, which was a state service, was controlled, and there was a lot of censorship in Ethiopia. Ethiopians cannot, had no right to express their political opinions. A number of journalists were arrested. The Tplf also promulgated an anti-terrorist law, and this anti-terrorist law was used as a pretext to arrest its opponents. A number of Ethiopian journalists were arrested, put into prison. Some of them were obliged to flee from the country. And any kind of political opposition legally was quite impossible when Ethiopia was governed by Tplf. And this is a situation that was created, the political situation that was created by the Tplf during the 27 years of its rule in Ethiopia. I would like to stop here.
Ok, je vais naturellement faire une traduction très brève. On va faire quelque chose de plus précis plus tard. Donc d'abord, il faut juste dire que l'Éthiopie s'est faite de plus de 84 ethnies. On a les Oromo et les Amara qui font plus ou moins le 60% de la population, mais il y a aussi les Tigray, les Érythréens, il y a beaucoup d'autres ethnies, Afara, beaucoup d'ethnies aussi minoritaires. Mais ça, c'est pour donner une idée de la composition du pays. Maintenant, ce qui se passe, c'est qu'au début, dans les années 90, ça faisait partie d'un groupe quand même étudiantine, mais au contraire des autres groupes qui étaient peut-être qui avaient d'autres idéologies un peu plus nationalistes, ce mouvement quand même déjà depuis la charte de 1976, il y avait déjà cette carte qui on peut comparer dans le sens en Côte d'Ivoire un peu avec la charte du Nord de Ouattara, donc dans le sens qu'ils avaient vraiment déjà une vision d'une Tigré plus large qui devait aussi englober qui voulait pas baser le pays, le nationalisme sur des bases vraiment disons civiques, mais plutôt ethniques. Donc ils cherchaient vraiment d'élargir leur terrain en envahissant par exemple des régions de l'Amara ou bien oui plus ou moins et d'autres régions. Et donc ils se sont très très élargis et sont devenus vraiment une organisation qui à travers aussi l'aide des ONG ils ont vraiment un peu infiltré et utilisé cette aide seulement pour s'engrandir comme groupe eux-mêmes. Et ce qui se passe, c'est qu'une fois arrivés au pouvoir, ils ont vraiment créé un espèce d'état de contrôle total, donc avec le contrôle des médias, avec le contrôle des militaires, donc c'est devenu vraiment un état, on pourrait dire, basé sur l'ethnie, qui voulait pas avoir un regard nationaliste où tous les ethnies appartenaient à l'Éthiopie, mais c'était plutôt vraiment une espèce de domination. Et je ne sais pas si j'ai bien traduit. Ça, c'est vraiment pour j'ai vraiment traduit en 2 mots. Maintenant, je passe la question. Ma deuxième question, c'est à Elias Amaré, que je vais dire en anglais et Pierrette va dire en français. Donc, Elias Amaré, you have described the Tplf rule as one of ethno-apartheid. Can you expand and also explain what has the relationship with the Tplf and Eritrea been till 2018? I just get a translation from Pierrette of the question.
Yes. Donc, Elias Amaré, vous avez qualifié le régime du Tplf d'ethno-apartheid. Pouvez-vous développer et également expliquer quelle a été la relation entre le Tplf et l'Érythrée jusqu'en 2018?
Well, thank you both for inviting me to the panel show, and I thank the previous speaker, my colleague, my sister from Ethiopia. Regarding the TPLF's relationship with Eritrea, as your previous guest, Aster, mentioned, the TPLF began its as a movement in 1975, some 47 years ago. So initially, when it was beginning, the more mature and older liberation struggle in Eritrea was led by the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. So naturally, they wanted assistance. They were trained and armed by the Eritrean rebels or liberation movement, the EPLF. But this relationship was, from its very beginning, a very troubled relationship. Your previous guest from Ethiopia, my sister Aster, mentioned that the TPLF in 1976 had its manifesto of Greater Tigray. In this manifesto, they envisioned, the leaders of the nascent or the new organization TPLF envisioned a Greater Tigray project for the establishment of an independent Republic of Tigray. And of course, they took large territories from the Amhara, the Wolkait, Raya area, from Eritrea also. Within Tigray itself, there were several ethnicities. But they said that everybody who speaks Tigrinya is Tigrawi. So by this reasoning, there were some Afar, some Saho, some Kunama who live in Tigray, and probably also some Ago ethnicities. These minority ethnic groups would, according to the manifesto, were forced to become Tigrayans or Tigrinya speakers. So it had this secessionist agenda, and when it faced massive criticism from the EPLF, that there was no reason for secession or separatism in Ethiopia. Also from the other progressive Ethiopian movements such as the EPRP and the All Ethiopian Socialist Party, the Meison, then they dropped this secessionist agenda and just claimed broadly for right of self-determination. But all along this TPLF manifesto, this secessionist agenda was there up to 1991. And once they seized power in 1991, with the help of the EPLF, mind you, because militarily it was the EPLF who was stronger and had more sophisticated armaments, mechanized brigades and tanks. Without the help of the EPLF, they could not have captured state power in Ethiopia. Anyways, once they captured state power in Ethiopia in 1991, they then, as your previous guest Aster mentioned, drafted a constitution of an ethnic federalism. Nowhere in Africa is this type of constitution ever witnessed. And in this constitution, they put in an article 39, that allowed for secession and separatism. This is a recipe for disaster anywhere in Africa. Why did they do that? Well, as your previous guest alluded, the Tigrayans are a minority in Ethiopia. And all along its elite, or the ethno-fascist group that formed the TPLF, had this mentality of inferiority complex, that they were looked down by the Amharas, they were oppressed by the Amharas, that the Eritreans looked down on them. And so there was this vendetta type of psychology when they seized power. So in order to rule Ethiopia as a minority, they had to divide it along ethnic lines. So that's why I call this system an ethno-apartheid system. Why ethno-apartheid? Because just as in South Africa during the apartheid regime, you had the white minority regime ruling over the black majority, And in order to rule them, it had to divide them by tribes into ethnic Bantustans. So in a similar way, the Tplf also divided Ethiopia into ethnic Bantustans, what they called ethnic Kalils or regional states. So they pit one group against the other, the Oromos against the Amharas, and every ethnic group against other ethnic groups. Also, they divided society along religious lines, sectarian lines. In this way, this tiny minority group, which only constituted 5% of the entire 110 million population of Ethiopia. And mind you, Ethiopia is also a huge multi-ethnic state, like over 80 ethnic groups inside Ethiopia. So this big country, which is unwieldy, if you rule it along ethnic lines, sooner or later you will have conflicts and tensions. And that is how for 27 years, from 1991 up to 2018, when it was overthrown, that this tiny group, ethno-fascist kleptocratic group, managed to rule Ethiopia through this system of ethno-apartheid. Unless it did that, it's a tiny minority, it could not have ruled it. But of course, the other great factor that made them to rule Ethiopia, to impose power on the rest of the majority of Ethiopians, was the huge, massive support of the United States and the European Union countries such as France, Germany, UK. Without this huge support, this tiny minority group could never have ruled Ethiopia. Never, never. And finally, when the Ethiopian people rose up in defiance, they were fed up of this minority rule of this kleptocratic group called Tplf that looted the wealth of Ethiopia to the tune of over $50 billion. Some estimate it may even be as high as $70 billion. The Ethiopian people had finally, they had it. So by the beginning of 2015, that is 7 years ago, you begin to witness in Ethiopia massive popular uprising of the youth in the Oromia region, in Amhara, and it spread like wildfire all over the country. And within 3 years, by 2018, the Tplf was forced to give power and flee to its home base in Tigray. And a reform government led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali then comes to power. Once Abiy Ahmed Ali comes to power, another factor also that I should make mention, the Tplf also only strives through conflicts and wars. It can only survive in a situation of war. So the other way it also ruled Ethiopia was by deflecting the anger of the people by igniting war against Eritrea. There was no reason in 1998 for a border conflict, a war to be ignited against Eritrea. But why did the Tplf did that? Because that's the only way it could deflect attention away from the people of Ethiopia, from their misery and their oppression by the tiny minority group. So by 2018, when the reform government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali comes to power, he automatically sees that peace with Eritrea is essential. And it is because he made peace with Eritrea that he then won the Nobel Peace Prize. And this ushers into the Horn of Africa, a new era of the new Horn of Africa of peace and stability. Tplf then, from its home base of Tigray, decides to scuttle this peace, to return back to power. And so by 2020, November, that is 14 months ago, it ignites a war against Eritrea and a war against Ethiopia. So these are the factors by which the Tplf, this tiny minority group, was able to rule Ethiopia for over 27 years through perpetual conflict, perpetual wars, igniting ethnic conflicts, interreligious conflicts, and so on and so forth. Even to this day, it is continuing to do that, and it is being supported by its Western patrons, such as the United States and the European Union countries. I hope briefly I have answered your question.
No, thank you. That was very, very clear. Donc, je vais juste vitement traduire. La chose importante qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que dans la Constitution qu'ils ont fait, que le Tplf a fait en 91, excusez-moi, 91 ou 94, 94, c'était une constitution qui était basée vraiment sur les ethnies. C'est quelque chose de jamais vu en toute l'Afrique. Dans chaque région, était vraiment séparé par les ethnies. On a donné le nom de la région par rapport au nom des ethnies. Ce que Elias Amar nous explique, c'est que justement, comme c'était une toute petite minorité, on parle de 5% de la population sur 110 millions quand même d'habitants dans le pays. La seule manière pour eux de pouvoir rester au pouvoir, c'était de mettre un groupe ethnique contre l'autre, de créer vraiment des... bon, d'abord, il faut dire qu'aussi dans la Constitution, il y avait un article, l'article 39, qui disait carrément qu'on peut faire une sécession, donc on peut devenir indépendante. Donc c'est pratiquement, disons, une manière de créer une constitution qui voudrait unifier un pays, mais permettre aux États de chacun de vouloir s'en aller, de partir s'ils veulent. Donc c'est un peu déjà le début pose des questions, des problèmes, non? Parce qu'on ne parle pas d'un État national basé sur des citoyens, mais des ethnies qui peuvent décider de quitter. Donc c'était un peu bizarre, mais la raison pour laquelle ils ont fait tout ça et pour laquelle ils ont aussi déclenché une guerre contre l'Érythrée, qui d'ailleurs, il faut se rappeler que le mouvement de libération de l'Érythrée a beaucoup aidé dans la guerre contre ce qui était Mengistu, qui était un peu un régime pro-soviétique, mais disons une vraie dictature à l'époque. Et c'était vraiment le mouvement de libération de l'Érythrée qui avait aidé aussi ce mouvement du Tplf à l'époque de libérer toute l'Éthiopie. Mais eux, ils se sont même allés contre les Érythréens en faisant vraiment une guerre en 98 pour 2 ans contre eux. Donc, on comprend que c'est un petit groupe qui se sentait aussi peut-être pas à la hauteur des autres, on ne comprend pas vraiment. Mais la chose qu'il souligne et qui est très, très important à dire, c'est que sans l'aide quand même de l'Occident, donc sans l'aide des États-Unis, de la France, et aussi de l'Union européenne en général, ce groupe n'aurait pas pu rester au pouvoir pendant 27 ans. Parce que c'est quand même un groupe qui est resté au pouvoir pour 27 ans jusqu'à jusqu'à 2018. Ce qui s'est passé qu'en 2015, il y a eu vraiment des grands soulèvements dans les pays qui ont duré 3 ans. Les gens en avaient vraiment marre parce que c'était un régime quand même très répressif. Et donc, ils ont réussi quand même à faire en sorte qu'eux, ils se retirent dans la région du Tigré avec l'arrivée de Abiy Ahmed en 2018. Mais malheureusement, ce mouvement a encore de nouveau déclenché la guerre. On va en parler un peu plus en détail pendant qu'on avance avec l'émission.
Yes, one more point that all African countries, with the only exception of Somalia, are multi-ethnic states. Cote d'Ivoire, for example, is, I don't know, 60 ethnic groups. Am I correct? Or somewhere in that line. So nowhere in Africa is a system of ethnic politics officially instituted as was by the Tplf in Ethiopia. Why? Because all the founding fathers of Africa after colonization saw it in the wisdom that this would be a recipe for disaster.
Yes.
You institute toxic ethnicity in politics, it would lead to civil war. And so it is only in Ethiopia that we saw this type of toxic ethnic politics. Otherwise, the other exception being South Africa, of course. But South Africa is a unique apartheid system. It was designed as a racist apartheid system to keep the majority black people. They had to divide them along tribal lines, the white minority regime. Sooner or later, of course, that white minority regime was overthrown. And Ethiopia is, of course, an exception, that it was the only country in Africa that was not colonized by Western colonialism. All other countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Mali, Eritrea, Somalia, was either colonized by the British, by French, by Italians, by Belgians, and so on and so forth. The only exception being Ethiopia as the one that was not colonized. But this minority group called Tplf instituted on Ethiopia a recipe for disaster called the ethnic federalism system.
Yes. Oui. Donc, c'est vrai, pour rajouter quelque chose, puis j'espère que tu le traduiras, mais rapidement, il a totalement raison, parce que dans le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire, c'est vrai qu'ils n'ont pas joué, parce qu'il y a plus de 60 ethnies, comme ils disaient en Côte d'Ivoire, mais ils ont joué contre le Nord et le Sud. Le Nord, qui était à majorité musulmane, c'est ce qui a été utilisé. Donc, c'est ce que nous, on appelle dans notre jargon les rebelles mandatés. On crée des rebelles. Tu vois, le plan de déstabilisation des pays d'Afrique, souvent appliqué par des puissances occidentales, comme Elias vient de le dire, est l'utilisation de rébellions armées, un groupe rebelle par procuration, dont le seul but est de provoquer un changement de régime, souvent un régime patriote et proche du peuple, dans le pays ciblé. En fait, c'est ce qui se passe. Dans le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire, ce groupe était les soi-disant forces nouvelles dirigées par le chef rebelle Guillaume Soro. Ce groupe n'avait aucune suite dans le pays. Il a été formé, entraîné sur la base militaire française au Burkina Faso. Ce groupe prétendait être trois différentes factions. Le MPCI, le MJP, le MPIGO, et couvrait différentes parties de la Côte d'Ivoire. Les forces nouvelles de Guillaume Soro a instrumentalisé les revendications ethniques, comme Elias vient de le dire, afin de justifier un coup d'État. La tentative du putsch du 19 septembre 2002 par les forces nouvelles qui scindent le pays en deux parties, la démarcation par l'armée française de Bouaké jusqu'au nord de la Côte d'Ivoire. Bouaké se trouve au centre, donc du centre jusqu'au nord, laissant ainsi le centre au nord occupé pendant plus de 8 ans par la rébellion. Et c'est un événement terrible pour la mémoire des Ivoiriens. Et où même le ministre de l'Intérieur de l'époque, Émile Bogadoudou, a perdu la vie à cette occasion-là. Donc, voilà, si tu pouvais juste résumer ça, Nicoletta, et comme ça, on pourra avancer sur la troisième question. À toi, Nicoletta. À toi, Niki. Donc, comme je disais, on t'a perdu à l'écran, hein, Niki.
Non, bon, ça va. C'est OK. Non, c'est...
On peut passer à la troisième question.
C'est très important le point qu'il fait, qu'il nous a et que je vais traduire. C'est justement que un peu comme qu'il n'y a aucun pays en Afrique qui a créé des régions sur la base des ethnies. Le seul qui l'a fait, c'était l'Afrique du Sud pendant l'apartheid, parce que c'était une minorité blanche. Comment est-ce qu'ils pouvaient prendre le pouvoir ou tenir le pouvoir sur une grande région? Ils ont créé les Bantoustans, non? C'était les Bantoustans, et ils ont vraiment renfermé les ethnies l'un dans l'autre pour une capacité de contrôler le pays. Et c'est un peu ça ce que eux ils ont fait. Mais comme ils l'ont mis même dans leur constitution, c'est comme s'ils avaient déjà créé une recette pour le désastre. Non, c'est comme si la constitution même avait déjà mis cette question qui allait porter un désastre de sécession quand même. Et si on réfléchit bien, aucun pays, ce que dit Elias justement, c'est que les pays après l'indépendance, dans l'époque de l'indépendance, n'ont jamais pensé à faire une division ethnique de ce genre parce qu'ils savaient quand même que ça allait porter des tensions inutiles, que peut-être quelqu'un d'autre aurait pu manipuler, justement comment ça s'est passé aussi dans le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire, comme on a vu. Donc, thank you for the we go to our second question, which is actually on Western, which considers a little bit the Western diplomacy. No, excuse me. No, sorry. We actually have to now talk about the 2nd of November 2020. So the 2nd of November 2020 attack, which was described by some as Ethiopia's equivalent of the USA 9/11. And I wanted to ask Aster if you can describe this attack on the part of the Tplf of the Northern Command. But before I just ask Pierrette to translate the question.
L'attaque du 2 novembre 2020 a été décrite par certains comme l'équivalent éthiopien du 11 septembre américain. Pouvez-vous décrire cette attaque de la part du Tplf du commandement Nord?
It was actually on the 4th of November 2020 against the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, or known as also as the Northern Command, has different types, has different aspects that should be mentioned. One of this was the aim of the Tplf when it attacked the federal troops in Tigray. Just to remember, the federal group or the Ethiopian National Defense Force has been in Tigray for almost 20 years. And when the Tplf launched a massive attack on the National Defense Force, their aim was to seize the strategic weapons which were under the control of the Ethiopian Defense Force. One of the factors is this. The second is it is an attempted coup d'etat. When they attacked the National Defense Force, they were quite convinced that by destroying the National Defense Force, they would be able to seize power in Ethiopia. So it was actually an attempted coup d'etat. The other factor regarding the attack against the Ethiopian troops in Tigray was it was also an ethnic cleansing. In fact, if we see we don't have the actual number of soldiers that were killed during that day by the Tplf. Some unofficial sources report that the soldiers that were killed were around 5,000 or 6,000 people. When they attacked the National Defense Force, they also perpetrated an ethnic cleansing. They killed all soldiers who were non-Tigrayans. The soldiers who came, who were considered to be Oromos, Amhara, Walaita, Kambata, were either killed or damaged, but whereas the Tigrayan soldiers were not killed. In fact, the higher officials of the Ethiopian Defense Force within the Northern Command collaborated with the special forces of Tplf in this attack that was perpetrated against the Ethiopian forces. Hence, it has different characteristics. Another thing to be mentioned about this attack is the sexual violence perpetrated against the women soldiers who were part of the Ethiopian Defense Forces. We have reports that the Tplf actually amputated the breasts of the women soldiers when they attacked the defense force. Hence, it has different characteristics. It was an attempted coup d'etat because they were planning and they seized the weapons, the strategic weapons under the Ethiopian armed forces. It was also an ethnic cleansing. At the same time, they exercised sexual violence against the women soldiers. Generally, what was the aim of the Tplf in attacking the armed forces of Ethiopia in Tigray? The main objective of Tplf was to seize power in Ethiopia. This was the main objective of that attack.
Thank you. Donc, je vais traduire. Naturellement, on va faire une traduction plus précise quand on va refaire la chose importante de comprendre, c'est que cette attaque du Tplf à l'époque, donc en novembre 2020, c'était pratiquement de attaquer l'un des centres principaux de l'armée nationale. C'était l'un des endroits où une grande partie de l'armée nationale était depuis 20 ans. Et donc, il y a trois aspects de cette attaque que Aster nous explique. C'est d'abord, leur but, c'était vraiment d'abord donc de prendre les armes, parce que c'était une région où il y avait beaucoup des armes de l'armée nationale éthiopienne. La deuxième chose, c'était que c'était vraiment une tentative de coup d'État, parce qu'ils voulaient vraiment prendre le pouvoir avec ça, en pensant peut-être de réussir, parce qu'ils se sont quand même élargis beaucoup. Et ils ont aussi ciblé vraiment les non-tigréens. C'est ça qui est assez terrible, c'est qu'on n'a pas les chiffres exacts, mais on a quand même des chiffres qui nous parlent de 6 000 morts des autres soldats, parce que vraiment dans la nuit, ils ont tué les soldats qui étaient des autres ethnies. Donc, si c'était des soldats Amara ou Oromo ou d'autres ethnies, ils les ont vraiment ciblés. Donc, c'était vraiment une attaque ethnique dans le sens en ciblant des ethnies qui n'étaient pas de leur ethnie. Donc, ça, c'est vraiment la troisième chose très importante à souligner de cette attaque de novembre 2020. Et l'autre chose, qu'il y avait quand même une collaboration de la part des autres officiers avec certains des Tplf, et la chose peut-être la plus désastreuse, c'était vraiment les violences sexuelles vis-à-vis des femmes, vis-à-vis des femmes soldats, auxquelles on a aussi des rapports qu'on leur coupait les seins, que vraiment il y avait c'est vraiment une violence extrême vis-à-vis des soldats femmes. And now I ask Elias, like Eritrea, which is not often known, was also attacked by the Tplf in November 2020. Or if you want to also add something about the attack in Ethiopia, because it was a very striking moment.
Yes. Well, to provide a context, the November 4, 2020 attack did not happen in a vacuum. It had a context. As we mentioned before, both of us, the Tplf lost power in Ethiopia in March, the end of March or beginning of April 2018. And within its coalition, EPRDF party, election was made for the party leadership. And so Dr. Abiy Ahmed Ali was elected as the party leader, and he becomes automatically the prime minister. So the TPLF then panicked and fled to its home base in the north, Tigray, and from there they didn't rest. They started to conspire as a means to return to power, and so they spread from there. Mind you, they had control of the army and the security intelligence apparatus of Ethiopia for 27 years. So they had network operatives, mercenaries all over Ethiopia, and they started to instigate conflicts all over Ethiopia to make Ethiopia ungovernable for the government of Abiy Ahmed Ali. So for 2 years, from 2018 up to 2020, they were doing all these kinds of destabilization, conflict and chaos strategy, as I call it. I had written extensively in 2018. In fact, I sort of foresaw that the TPLF would not rest, would not accept defeat and live with the situation, but they will try a strategy of chaos and conflict to destabilize Ethiopia. If they cannot rule, then nobody else can rule it. That's what they have always been saying this on record. Even while they were ruling Ethiopia, my sister Aster will corroborate this for me. Its rulers such as Sibhat Naga, the eminence Greece, the grand old man, was saying, if we don't rule Ethiopia through this EPRDF, it will disintegrate. It's either us or our system of ethnic federalism or disintegration. So once they lost power, they actively worked for this type of chaos, strategy of chaos in Ethiopia. They also looked negatively at the peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea, because as I pointed out earlier, TPLF can thrive only through conflicts and wars. So they looked with disfavor at the peace with Eritrea, and they had to disrupt that. They didn't accept it. the peace with Somalia also that was made. So this tripartite peace, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, was not in their favor, and they tried to disrupt it as much as possible. Mind you, while they were in power also, they had accumulated huge arsenal, strategic weaponry, and hid them in underground bunkers in Tigray, because they controlled Ethiopia. They controlled the military. In the Ethiopian military, the federal army, 90% of the generals were of Tigrayan ethnicity. All the officer ranks, generals, colonels, majors, it was dominated by Tigrayans, this tiny minority group. Minority ethnic group of 5% controlled essentially the military, the security intelligence apparatus, the economy, everything in Ethiopia was controlled by them. So they had amassed in Tigray huge arsenal, rocket missiles, strategic weaponry. So by November 2020, they decided that they would do a coup d'etat, as my sister Aster pointed out. And in the dead of the night, while the Federal Army soldiers were asleep, they attacked them. The Northern Command, which was based in Tigray, of the Federal Army, numbered, its troop strength was 32,000. Out of these 32,000, 10,000 were of Tigrayan ethnicity, members of the Tplf. So the 10,000 automatically switched sides. Their loyalty was only to the Tplf, not to the big nation of Ethiopia. And the rest, in the dead of the night, they attacked them, they slaughtered them, they raped the women, soldiers. Only 5,000 to 6,000 fled northwards and crossed the border to Eritrea to seek refuge and asylum. Of course, Eritrea accepted them. And by this time, the Tplf also started to fire rocket missiles into Eritrea. It had what became later from intelligence findings and from captive Tplf soldiers, in Eritrea, it had 100 targets for bombardment by this long-range rocket missile. So they fired these rocket missiles, and it's on record. In fact, the American Secretary of State at that time, Mike Pompeo, came out and condemned this widening of the conflict to make it regional. That was their intention. So the intention of the Tplf in this November 4, 2020 attack was, one, to destroy the Federal Army and march southwards and capture state power by reaching Addis Ababa, and at the same time also to attack Eritrea and to invade Eritrea and effect regime change in Eritrea. This was their plan, and so Eritrea was forced. It's been attacked, and its ally, the federal government, also is being attacked. So it had to defend itself and its sovereignty. So it cleared the Tplf. It had to capture the strategic weaponry that was in the hands. It was dangerous for Eritrea's survival and also for Ethiopia's survival. So this terrorist group had to be contained. I give this analogy for American audience because I am living here in America. Imagine in America, for example, one state of, let's say, Iowa, decides to attack the Federal Army, which is based in that state, in the dead of the night. The state militia of Iowa attacks the Federal Army. Would the federal government in Washington, D.C. still sit idly by? Of course not. No. This is mutiny and insurrection, and any government has to take appropriate measures to bring back law and order and ensure stability and sovereignty. So this is, in a nutshell, what happened in November 4 of 2020. It was betrayal, treasonous act, and many countries in Africa understood this. African Union also understood this, but we'll go into that question, I suppose, later in depth.
Thank you so much, Elias. So, donc, il faut naturellement mettre l'attaque du 4 novembre 2020 dans un contexte. Depuis que le Tplf avait perdu le pouvoir avec l'arrivée de Abiy Ahmed en 2018, qui était élu comme premier ministre, ce qui s'est passé, c'est qu'eux, ils ont un peu paniqué, non? Ils se sont sentis qu'ils étaient en train de perdre le pouvoir. Alors, comme Elias justement souligne, la seule manière pour eux de rester au pouvoir, c'est de créer du chaos. Ça me rappelle un peu aussi Ouattara, quand même, qui dit aussi soit c'est moi, soit c'est personne qui règne, non? Il disait ça. I'm just doing a small comparison with Ivory Coast. It's very, Ouattara is very much like that too. It's either me or nobody else. He said that even throughout. Et donc, c'est un peu ça c'est incroyable parce qu'ils disent vraiment soit c'est nous, soit c'est personne d'autre qui va être donc qui va prendre le pouvoir dans ce sens. Et attendez, excusez-moi, je me suis perdue un moment. Oui, donc c'est incroyable parce qu'il faut quand même se rappeler que on parle ici. Non, attendez, je me suis perdue. Donc, par exemple, ils n'ont aussi pas accepté le fait que le gouvernement d'Abiy Ahmed était aussi en train de faire une paix aussi dans la région, pas seulement avec l'Érythrée, mais aussi avec la Somalie. Donc, ça dérangeait qu'il y avait une autre, disons, une autre constitution, même des trois pays qui allaient se rapprocher sans que eux, ils avaient un rôle. Non, pour eux, c'était soit nous, soit la désintégration du pays. C'était vraiment un peu comme ça. Donc, ils n'étaient pas d'accord. Même avec le fait d'arriver à cette paix dans la région. Parce que il ne faut pas oublier qu'une minorité de ce genre, s'il y a la paix, c'est pas eux qui vont être au pouvoir. Et c'était ça leur but, c'était de toujours créer des problèmes. Et ce qui s'est passé cette nuit-là, donc il faut d'abord rappeler aussi qu'ils ont tenu des élections sans que ils auraient pu ou dû les tenir. Mais après, la chose terrible, c'est que cette nuit-là, cette fameuse nuit-là du novembre 2020, le fameux coup d'État, il y avait quand même 32 000 soldats, dont 10 000 étaient plus ou moins de Tplf. Et c'est vraiment dans la nuit qu'ils ont attaqué tous leurs frères et sœurs africains. Ils les ont massacrés vraiment. Elias nous explique qu'il y a plus ou moins 6 000 qui sont allés vers l'Érythrée, donc qui sont allés se réfugier vers l'Érythrée. Mais ils ont vraiment, c'était vraiment un vrai massacre. Et ce qui se passe depuis, c'est qu'ils n'ont pas seulement fait ça, mais ils ont aussi attaqué avec des roquettes l'Érythrée même. Et à l'époque, sous l'administration Trump, il y avait même Mike Pompeo qui avait dit oh mais allez, ne faites pas ça, vous allez amener quand même déstabiliser toute la région. Donc il y avait cette critique au contraire.
Yeah, this is on record. He even tweeted about this. I have a screenshot captured of this for
il y a
the
même
audience.
un tweet de Pompeo qui avait dit ça. Et c'est bizarre parce que l'administration Biden fait le contraire, mais bon. Et donc, because Biden seems to be the contrary, no, as we see. Et donc, c'était vraiment, il voulait vraiment faire réaliser un vrai coup d'État. Et Elias Amar nous explique un peu comme il était aux États-Unis. Il donne l'exemple de l'Ohio, un État de l'Iowa qui décide à un certain moment d'attaquer l'armée fédérale,
Oui.
ou bien une région de la France qui décide d'attaquer l'armée fédérale. Et donc, c'est clair que chaque pays prendrait tout de suite des dispositions nécessaires pour bloquer ça. Voilà.
Tout à fait.
Ça,
tout à fait.
Et là, on vient vers, donc on peut expliquer ce qui s'est passé, qui est ce groupe, et là, on va vers la question de la Western diplomacy. So, I ask you, in Ivory Coast, the international community pushed via French-backed peace negotiation known as Marcoussis, that the legitimate Gbagbo government negotiate and include in his government a rebel group not voted by anyone. These rebels were even split into 3 fictitious groups which existed only on paper so as to give them more weight during the negotiation process. This same request, pushing the Abiy Ahmed government to negotiate with the Tplf, has been heavily pushed by Western states, going as far as setting up a fake rebel alliance of people no one had ever heard of in Ethiopia in a meeting in Washington. And despite the fact that the Tplf had been declared a terrorist group by the Ethiopian parliament in May 2021. And my question is, therefore, how has Western diplomacy dealt with this crisis since November 2020? But maybe, Pierrette, you can...
in French. Yes. Ouais. En Côte d'Ivoire, la communauté internationale, CEDEAO, Union africaine, Union européenne, ONU, a poussé via une négociation de paix soutenue par la France, comme connu sous le nom de processus de paix de Marcoussis, que le gouvernement légitime Gbagbo négocie et inclut. Ces organisations internationales ont obligé le gouvernement de Gbagbo à inclure dans son gouvernement un groupe rebelle qui n'a pas été élu par personne. Ces rebelles ont même été scindés en 3 groupes fictifs qui n'existent que sur le papier afin de leur donner plus de poids dans le processus de négociation. Cette même demande poussant le gouvernement Abiy Ahmed à négocier avec le Tplf a été fortement poussée par les États occidentaux, allant jusqu'à la mise en place d'une fausse alliance rebelle de personnes dont personne n'a jamais entendu parler en Éthiopie lors d'une réunion à Washington, et malgré le fait que le Tplf a été déclaré groupe terroriste par le Parlement éthiopien en mai 2021. Donc, la question s'adresse à Aster et à Elias. Pardon. Comment la diplomatie occidentale a-t-elle géré la crise depuis novembre 2020?
Well, when we talk of diplomacy regarding the Tplf and the conflict in Ethiopia, I think we have to go back to the beginning of the 1990s. We remember that till 1991, Ethiopia was governed by a military, we can call it a military dictatorship. At the head of this government was Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam. At that time, Mengistu Haile Mariam had a very good relationship with various socialist countries, especially with the Soviet Union. In fact, at that time, we remember that there was what is called the Eastern Bloc. And Mengistu Haile Mariam's government used to declare itself as a socialist or a communist-oriented government. Hence, when in 1991, when the Tplf came to power, the Western diplomacies were actually favorable towards Tplf, because in the West, the government or the regime, I would say, of Mengistu Haile Mariam was considered a leftist government, a socialist and a communist government. Hence, the downfall of Mengistu Haile Mariam and the coming to power of Tplf was accepted favorably by the Western democracy. And moreover, we have to take into consideration another issue regarding the diplomacy and the conflict, especially when we speak about the Tplf. That is, Tplf almost most of the time, it used to promote what's called a shifting ideology. And because it promoted this shifting ideology, that is, on one side, it presented itself as a political entity or as a political group which is anti-imperialist. On the other side, in its relation with foreign diplomats, it described itself as if it is favorable for a liberal system. And this shifting ideology has helped a lot the Tplf when it was governing Ethiopia. In fact, the support to Tplf came from groups, from left-wing groups, as well as from right-wing groups. And when we see, a lot of things have been done by the Tplf during the 27 years when it governed Ethiopia. It has done a large networking. It has created a close relationship with political leaders and also in the Western academic world. Because of this, it was able to gain support from the right wing, and from the left wing. Some of the examples I would like to mention now is, for example, the visit of America's President Barack Obama in Ethiopia in 2015. At that time, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia was Desalegn Hailemariam, because Meles Zenawi died in 2012, and Ethiopia's Prime Minister was Desalegn Hailemariam. When Barack Obama went to Addis, one of the infamous statements that he made during that visit is saying that Ethiopia had a democratically elected government. The reality in Ethiopia was not that. In Ethiopia, there was no democracy. There was a number of violations of human rights. People had no opportunity to contrast or oppose the government. Sometime before, during, after the elections. And
Can I stop you for a moment? There's a very strong noise in the background. I don't know if our technician can fix it. Can you hear it?
you don't hear me? Now you hear me?
I hear a very
Yeah,
strange.
we hear you okay, but there was a background noise.
There's a very strong background noise. I don't know where our technician is, if he can fix it.
Yeah, maybe I'll try to mute.
I'll try and mute myself also.
Shall I continue, Nicoleta? I don't hear you.
You are muted,
I can't hear you.
Nicoleta.
Nicoleta,
Et Darcis, tu peux voir un moment, il y a un son terrible dans le fond. Une espèce
Moi, je ne
d'écho.
l'entends pas, le son. Je l'ai
can
entendu, mais
hear
ça s'est arrêté.
I can hear. Okay, we can go on. 2015. Sorry, Obama.
okay, I would like to add something more. For example, when I was saying that Tplf was promoting a shifting ideology, we could see that when the Tplf governed Ethiopia, Ethiopia was able to gain financial support from two big capitalist institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Coming to the visit of Barack Obama in 2015, Barack Obama stated that Ethiopia had democratically elected government. This has created a number of opposition to the statement of Barack Obama from the diaspora, Ethiopian diaspora, from the people of Ethiopia, from opposition leaders in Ethiopia, and particularly from Ethiopian journalists, because the reality was completely different. As I mentioned before, immediately after the elections in Ethiopia, there was a huge manifestation in Addis, and hundreds of people were killed. A number of people were put into prison. Hence, in spite of these facts, Barack Obama came to Ethiopia and stated that Ethiopia had a democratically elected government. And the strangest thing was that whenever there is an election, the Tplf or the EPRDF coalition stated that they have won the election by getting 99% of the vote, which is impossible. No political party can gain 99% of the vote of any population. Moreover, just to add some other examples, we could cite, for example, Susan Rice. She was practically a close friend of our ex-Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. After Meles Zenawi died in 2012, Susan Rice said that Mallas Zenawi was a visionary leader, and he was a close friend of hers, of America. We could cite other people. There were also scholars and academicians who had a close relationship with the Tplf leaders. For example, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's a Norwegian name, Ketil Trombolt, a Norwegian scholar. And some other person is Martin Plaut, the ex-BBC correspondent for Africa. All these people, the academic world and the political leaders, had close connection with the Tplf. We could also mention Blair. Blair was also a close friend of Mallas Zenawi, the ex-prime minister of Ethiopia. Mallas Zenawi was invited to international meetings when he was alive. Hence, the political position of various Western diplomats in favor of Tplf, we could say, is a cumulative effect or the cumulative result of the networking that the Tplf made during the 27 years that it ruled Ethiopia. Ethiopia has been, it's quite obvious that Ethiopia has been under pressure from the, because of Western diplomacy. There are, especially after the conflict, there are some issues that the Western diplomats, governments used to mention or used to request the Ethiopian government. For example, one of the questions that were usually mentioned or they used to request the Ethiopian government was to stop the war in Tigray immediately. This was one of the questions. And the other was the withdrawal of Ethiopian federal troops from Tigray and the withdrawal of the Eritrean troops, as well as, this is really astonishing, the withdrawal of the special regional forces of Amhara from Tigray. Although we know that the special forces of Amhara have never gone to Tigray. The other question is the Ethiopian government was continuously condemned of human rights violations. This regarded also the Eritrean troops in Tigray. Moreover, one of the issues that was repeatedly said by the Western diplomats and journalists as well is the access of humanitarian, the immediate access of humanitarian aid to the people of Tigray. These are the most important questions raised by Western diplomats regarding the Ethiopian government. Following this, there were some, we could say, some kind of economic sanctions taken by the European Union and the United States, and this was followed also by the visa sanctions imposed on Ethiopian leaders and also the Tplf leaders. And in this moment, I think there is a bill known as HR 6600, if I remember well, a bill that is to be approved. I don't know. There might come other sanctions on Ethiopia. These are some of the pressures and the relationships that were between Ethiopia and the foreign diplomats and the Western governments.
You are muted, Nicoletta.
Donc excusez-moi. Donc, tout au début, le Tplf avait un appui parce qu'il se faisait passer un peu comme un groupe anti-impérialiste, comme ça, mais tout de suite, ils se sont quand même transformés dans ils ont, disons, laissé tomber tout cet aspect-là de leur lutte. Et pendant 27 ans, ils ont eu vraiment un appui, comme on l'avait dit aussi avant, très, très fort à partir de l'Occident. Et on peut donner un exemple, par exemple, un exemple du voyage d'Obama en 2015, où il y avait eu des élections et où quand même, il y a eu beaucoup de morts, beaucoup des personnes qui ont été mises en prison. Et Obama arrive et dit que tout va bien. On connaît ça aussi. Et donc, cette manière un peu de vraiment soutenir ce régime au-delà de tout. Et la coalition de ce régime, et même, on a d'autres exemples comme Susan Rice, qui, quand l'un des, disons, leaders du Tplf, Meles Zenawi, était mort, elle avait dit à ses funérailles que c'était d'abord un très proche ami à elle et que c'était vraiment un leader visionnaire. Donc, on peut voir vraiment une position très pro ce groupe sans jamais le critiquer. Et il y a aussi des experts comme le Norvégien Tromvel ou aussi Martin Plaut. Et ça, c'est vraiment des experts, des académiciens qui poussent la ligne du Tplf au-delà et toujours vraiment... ceux qui se passent, ils sont toujours là à l'appui. Comme aussi quelqu'un comme Blair, comme Tony Blair, qui, bon, on le trouve tout le temps. Hein, je crois qu'il a aussi aujourd'hui l'aide de Kagame, non, on sait. Et donc, ça c'est ma parenthèse. Et donc, on voit vraiment qu'ils étaient toujours pendant les 27 ans vraiment à leur faveur. Et là maintenant, par contre, après quand la guerre a commencé, ils ont posé des questions assez bizarres dans le sens qu'ils demandaient que pas seulement l'armée se retire, donc pratiquement que l'armée ne doit pas défendre la souveraineté du pays, le territoire du pays, mais qu'il devrait se retirer, qu'il ne devrait pas attaquer. Et en plus, il y a même des forces spéciales de chaque région qui protègent ces régions-là, comme par exemple dans la région d'Amara, et ils demandaient même que ces forces-là se retirent, donc pratiquement qu'ils ne se défendent pas. Si on pense à la crise post-électorale ivoirienne, quand même, on voit que c'était un peu la même chose, non? On demandait aux forces de Gbagbo de ne pas réagir par rapport à des attaques quand même qui n'étaient pas nécessairement légales. Et donc, l'autre chose que l'Occident, tant dans les journaux, etc., on continue à dire qu'il y a aussi une affabulation totale, c'est l'accès humanitaire. Ils disent tout le temps dans les journaux, j'ai même vu dans Le Monde, dans d'autres journaux, qu'on dit tout le temps qu'on n'a pas l'accès humanitaire à la région de Tigré, qu'il n'y a pas un accès. Et aussi, on a fait des sanctions quand même vis-à-vis de l'Éthiopie et aussi de l'Érythrée. Voilà. Et je pose la même question à Elias. Also, is how for you has the Western diplomacy dealt with this crisis since November 2020?
More or less the same pattern as Aster has explained in Ethiopia. Remember, the Tplf regime, while it was in power in Ethiopia for 27 years, had managed to rule Ethiopia with the blessing, the full support, the financial, economical, military, political cover, diplomatic cover of Western governments, in particular the United States. The United States, after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, had this doctrine of controlling Africa through anchor states. To control Africa, you have 4 anchor states. For the western region of Africa, the anchor state, designated anchor state, was Nigeria. For the northern, the Arab North Africa, Egypt was the designated anchor state. For the Horn of Africa, East Africa, Ethiopia was the designated anchor state. And for the southern region of Africa, of course, South Africa. So through these 4 big states, you designated them as the major client states, proxy forces to control the 4 regions. And thus you ensure your imperialist hegemony over Africa. This was the United States strategy. So for this reason, the Tplf regime was given all kinds of support, massive diplomatic cover. While it ruled Ethiopia, it committed massive atrocities, human rights violations, even genocides. such as in the Gambela region of Western Ethiopia, in the Ogaden Somali region, in Amhara, in Oromia. I mean, the crimes it committed were horrendous, but it was always covered up. The media gave it a rosy, picture. Meles Zenawi was the darling of the West. He was wined and dined. He was invited to the World Economic Forum in Davos, in big conferences, and he was touted as the visionary leader. As my sister Esther mentioned, Tony Blair, for example, had this project called NEPAD, New Economic Partnership for African Development. And so the two leaders he designated for this in Africa were Thabo Mbeki and Meles Zenawi. Meles Zenawi and the Tplf were the most corrupt kleptocratic regime in Africa, I could say. But yet the Western governments gave them all the time favorable political, diplomatic cover and media coverage. And they covered up their crimes, their massive crimes against humanity. This was during the 27 years of their reign in power. So, for example, with the pushing, the prodding of the United States, the Tplf regime invaded Somalia in 2006. This is a sovereign nation. So the invasion of a sovereign nation was blessed by the United States, and even the regional organization called IGAD, just as you have ECOWAS in West Africa, we have in East Africa, Horn of Africa, a regional organization called IGAD. IGAD even gave it its blessing. So the neighboring puppet states like Kenya, Uganda also kept silent while a sovereign nation was being invaded. The only country to oppose this was Eritrea. And for this, Eritrea was punished by having sanctions imposed on it at the United Nations Security Council. So it's this kind of political machinations, cover-ups, diplomatic cover-ups. Even the Western human rights organizations never fully reported and publicized the massive atrocities and crimes against humanity that Tplf committed in Ethiopia in its 27 years of misrule and tyrannical misrule. The most brutal, I mean, tens of thousands of political prisoners, disappearing of journalists and politicians, genocide in Gambela, genocide in Ogaden Somali region, and all kinds of brutalities were committed, but nothing whatsoever. Now you fast forward to November 2020 when Tplf ignited this war. Its former supporters in the West, in particular in Washington, those who were in the Obama administration, people like Susan Rice, like Samantha Power, like who were waiting in the wings. Remember, November 3, 2020 was also the US election. So Trump had lost by that time. It was not coincidence that they launched this war on Ethiopia and Eritrea on that particular date, November 3, November 4. Because in US political system, if the president loses, that becomes a lame duck period. So until January 2021, when the new administration assumes power, the existing president is called a lame duck president. There's nothing much he can do, okay? So this allowed them to carry out this treasonous insurrectionary war with impunity. And of course, those who were waiting in the wings were giving it coverage behind the scene. The massive Western media propaganda was giving it favorable coverage. The Tplf was the aggressor, but the Western media was painting it as the victim. So you have this propaganda ploy of inverting the victim and the aggressor. So the Tplf was committing massacre against the Amhara civilians in a place called Maikadra. Horrendous massacre, over 1,000 people that it killed through its militias. This is recorded. Even Amnesty International had to grudgingly admit this because it was impossible to hide by the time the facts came out. And yet, this was somehow obfuscated, covered up, and they manufactured something called Aksum Massacre, which never happened, and blamed Eritrea for this. So you had this kind of manufactured genocide, manufactured atrocities in Tigray, rape, and what have you. And the aggressor, the Tplf, became the victim. And through this kind of media coverage, cover up and diplomatic cover up, then the atrocities, the crimes against humanity of the Tplf was covered up, as was done in its previous 27 years in power in Ethiopia.
Thank you. Ok, donc si on regarde dans l'histoire, disons l'administration, on regarde dans les 27 ans qu'ils étaient au pouvoir, que ce gouvernement était au pouvoir du Tplf, on voit quand même que les États-Unis avaient toujours dans la région de l'Afrique des États auxquels elles s'accrochaient, qui étaient un peu les États phares qui allaient contrôler le reste de la région. Donc on avait le Nigeria en Occident, on avait l'Égypte au nord, l'Éthiopie dans l'est et l'Afrique du Sud dans le sud. C'était un peu les pays, et même avec des crimes atroces qu'ils avaient commis, ils avaient commis des génocides dans la région de Gambela, de Amara aussi, comment on dit ça en français, je ne sais pas.
Somalie.
Ogaden, c'est la région Somalie, Ogaden. Là aussi, il y avait vraiment eu des génocides, des massacres atroces. Mais vu l'appui qu'ils ont eu, spécialement de la part de l'Occident, des États-Unis, et il n'y a jamais eu une tentative d'en parler. Ça a été toujours, disons, mis sous, comment on dit, mis sous le tapis, comme on connaît très bien. Et donc, même le Meles Zenawi, comme on avait parlé avant, il a été invité à Davos ou dans les grandes institutions, au World Economic Forum, au Forum économique mondial. Et on avait toujours donné l'impression que c'était vraiment, non, on voulait donner cette impression-là que c'était un pays, même quand ils ont envahi la Somalie, l'Éthiopie avait envahi la Somalie en 2006. Je crois que c'était 6 ou 5. Somalia was 2006 or 5?
2006, correct, yeah.
2006, ils avaient envahi la Somalie. Ils ont eu vraiment... non, les États-Unis n'avaient rien dit. Et même dans la sous-région, on a un peu... comme on a ECOWAS en Afrique de l'Ouest, on a IGAD en Afrique de l'Est. Et là aussi, aucun pays n'avait rien dit. Ni le Kenya, ni l'Ouganda. Imaginez-vous, ils sont en train d'envahir un autre pays. Et le seul pays qui était contre cette guerre, c'était l'Érythrée. Mais tout de suite, les Américains les ont sanctionnés. Non, ils ont tout de suite reçu des sanctions, toujours dans le but vraiment de cette couverture. Donc vraiment, une brutalité incroyable où des milliers de personnes ont été torturées, des journalistes qui sont disparus, des politiciens. Et tout ça a jamais été mis en avant parce que caché. Et cette même administration, elle est venue, c'est de nouveau l'administration d'Obama qui est revenue au pouvoir. Et ce que Elias Amar elle souligne, c'est que l'attaque qui est survenue de 3 ou 4 novembre 2020, c'est pas vraiment par hasard, parce que normalement dans les élections américaines, quand l'un des deux présidents a déjà gagné, dans cette période-là, avant qu'il entre dans le pouvoir, donc de novembre en janvier, il y a un peu un moment où le président sortant ne peut vraiment rien faire. Et c'est pour ça que tous ces personnages après de l'administration Obama, comme Susan Rice, Samantha Power, ils sont après revenus au pouvoir, et c'est eux qui avaient déjà avant fait toute cette couverture que rien sort. Et vraiment des choses terribles, parce qu'on ne parle pas du fait que même le 9 novembre 2020, il y a eu le massacre de Maïkandra, qui était un massacre où on parle de 1000 personnes qui étaient tuées. La chose terrible, c'est qu'on n'en parle pas du tout, on fait semblant que ce n'était pas autant grave, et on a même inventé un autre massacre le massacre d'Aksum qui est en réalité une fabrication. Et peut-être on pourra en parler plus tard dans une autre question qu'on a sur... On passe donc tout de suite, on va passer sur la question des médias. Now, we answered a little bit of this already, maybe, but I'll make the link with Ivory Coast. So corporate media, corporate mainstream media began a huge disinformation campaign as soon as Laurent Gbagbo came to power in Ivory Coast in 2006. Became to in Ivory Coast in 2000. In 2006, Laurent and Simone Gbagbo even won a case at the Paris Court of Appeal, who had accused them of having death squads, which was, you know, they won the case in the end because it was found to be totally unfounded. Yet this stigmatization remains to this day. At the height of the crisis in 2011, Gbagbo was painted as the illegitimate dictator wanting to hold on to power by all means. This is still found in media despite a 9-year kangaroo trial at the International Criminal Court, which acquitted him of all charges, and an acquittal for alleged crimes against humanity also of his Simone David Gbagbo in Ivory Coast. So my question is, how has we've covered it a little bit already, but how has mainstream media, the corporate media, dealt with this crisis? We've already talked a little bit about this. What are the major talking points of the so-called Africa experts, what they have used in this crisis? Si tu veux traduire, Ima.
Oui, donc justement dans ce passage, dans ce paragraphe, on parle du rôle des médias, le rôle des médias dans les pays en guerre. Donc les médias grand public ont lancé une vaste campagne de désinformation peu après l'arrivée au pouvoir de Laurent Gbagbo en Côte d'Ivoire. En 2006, il a même obtenu gain de cause devant la cour d'appel de Paris contre le journal Le Monde pour diffamation. Le prestigieux journal français ayant en effet écrit que lui et son épouse Simone Gbagbo avaient fait usage d'escadrons de la mort. Un fait totalement infondé. Pourtant, cette stigmatisation demeure à ce jour. Au plus fort de la crise de 2011, Gbagbo a été dépeint comme le dictateur illégitime voulant s'accrocher au pouvoir par tous les moyens. Cela se retrouve encore dans les médias malgré un procès kangourou de 9 ans tenu à la Cour pénale internationale qu'il a acquitté de toutes les charges et un acquittement pour les crimes présumés contre l'humanité de Simone et Yves Gbagbo. Donc la question, c'est comment les principaux médias entreprennent-ils traiter la crise et quels principaux arguments souvent erronés les soi-disant experts de l'Afrique utilisent-ils pour décrire cette crise? Donc, nous attendons la réponse de Elias, puis de Aster ou Elias, l'un après l'autre. Mais ce serait intéressant d'avoir cet éclairage par rapport aux médias sur le cas de l'Éthiopie.
Shall I start? Okay. I'll start. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Regarding the Western media, Western media has played a crucial role in disseminating disinformation and fake news regarding the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia. But on the other hand, I would like to say that the Ethiopian government was not really prepared to retaliate to the campaign of disinformation and fake news that started immediately after the conflict in Tigray. The Ethiopian federal forces were able to win the war within a period of 3 weeks, but this was a military victory. On the other hand, Ethiopia and the Ethiopian government, I think, were not well prepared to counter the propaganda that was opened by the Tplf after the conflict. The inability there was the inability of the Ethiopian government to explain to the international media the cause of the conflict and the effects of the conflict gave the upper hand to Tplf regarding the propaganda war. And Tplf actually hijacked the narration regarding the war, and it used it for itself. And this continued for a number of months and weeks after the conflict. The Tplf, as we remember, has invested millions of dollars in recruiting activists and as well as lobbyists to work on the propaganda field. For example, at the beginning of immediately after the war, we have seen a digital warfare opened against Ethiopia as well as Eritrea. There were thousands of tweets every day. And at the same time, the involvement of the international media, like, for example, the CNN, Reuters, Al Jazeera, and papers like the Washington Post, all these international media have helped a lot in spreading sometimes news that were exaggerated. Sometimes they were totally fake news. Anyway, their reporting was, in general, could be said they were not impartial in reporting the conflict. They were partial and mostly one-sided. At the same time, in general, the information that was spread by the international media regarded either that the Ethiopian government used to hinder humanitarian aid to the Tigrians, or that the Ethiopian forces and the Eritrean forces committed massacre in Tigray. For example, what was mentioned before, that is the massacre in Aksum, was declared by an Ethiopian living in the northern America. An Ethiopian guy of Tigrian origin appeared in a television program, or I don't know, in YouTube, and he declared that he has directly witnessed the massacre, the Aksum massacre, and he said that he himself was an Orthodox priest. It was later found out that he was not an Orthodox priest, and he was not in Aksum, and no massacre has taken place in Aksum. We could cite a number of cases like this. And moreover, besides the international media, some of the scholars I mentioned as well have contributed in spreading fake news and disinformation. For example, I remember one of the news that were disseminated by the Tplf and the Tplf supporters was that the Ethiopian government has bombarded the Mekelle University, and the students that were in the university were also killed during the bombardment. Later on, this was discovered that it was a fake news. Hence, by doing this, by spreading propaganda campaign and disinformation, they affected, I would say, the international image of Ethiopia. In fact, because of this news and disinformation, as my friend mentioned before, Ethiopia was became the aggressor, and the Tplf was transformed into a victim.
Ok, je vais vous traduire donc ce qu'on peut dire donc par rapport au cas des médias internationaux. Disons qu'il y a eu beaucoup de fake news. même après les 3 semaines de la victoire quand même du gouvernement sur ce mouvement du Tplf, où il y a eu un moment où la guerre s'est arrêtée pour un moment, et il y a eu quand même une attaque médiatique qui était très très fort et qui continuait. Et le gouvernement éthiopien s'est retrouvé un peu incapable de répondre à toute cette attaque. Parce qu'imaginez, non, un peu tous les journaux et de toutes les parties. Et donc, il y a eu vraiment aussi une espèce de guerre digitale, dans le sens qu'il y a eu des milliers de tweets, de fake news partout, de tous les journaux. Et la plupart de l'information était impartiale, toujours d'un côté. Et vraiment, par exemple, les choses qu'on disait, ce que le gouvernement d'Abiy Ahmed était en train de faire en sorte que l'aide humanitaire n'arrive pas dans la région du Tigré. Ou bien on avait aussi et une autre histoire assez bizarre, c'était le fait que dans la région de Tigré, il y avait excusez-moi, j'étais un peu, j'ai vu l'image de Bagbo, j'ai pas compris. Donc, il y a eu ce bloc de aide. C'était l'une des choses. Mais par exemple, ils ont même fabriqué un personnage qui avait dit qu'il était un prêtre orthodoxe
Oui.
qui avait vu les massacres de Aksum, et après on découvre que c'est quelqu'un qui habitait aux États-Unis. On a même trouvé la photo du mec, donc c'était vraiment complètement fabriqué. Et c'est ça qui vraiment fait peur. Ou même, on avait dit qu'il y avait une attaque à l'université de Mekele. The University of Mekele was, you saying, was attacked. It was said that it was attacked.
Yeah, by Ethiopian forces.
I didn't
Oui,
hear well.
Niki, je te coupe pas, mais ça fait penser à la fille de l'ambassadeur qui disait à l'ONU pour la Libye que l'hôpital avait été des bébés couveuses avaient été bombardés.
Ouais, non, mais c'est incroyable. Donc, c'est vraiment ça, vraiment une très, très forte campagne de désinformation. Et on pose la... before going on to ask you the same question, Elias, I just want to show a small clip of Alex Deval, just to show you what type of disinformation we are talking about. Si la régie peut montrer la vidéo de Alex Deval, l'un des soi-disant experts sur l'Éthiopie et sur la guerre en question.
Forces is to negotiate its surrender or withdrawal from Tigray. That is
the future of Ethiopia will for sure be very, very different to the past. That full stream of a revived empire will be buried for good.
And members of the Tigray Defense Forces, you have won the respect of everybody. The doctrine of a just war has rarely had so clear an exemplar.
Yes. Donc, il parle d'une juste guerre. If you want to comment on this, and also in general on the huge fabrication or fake media that is around this crisis.
Well, for viewers from Côte d'Ivoire and West Africa, the same pattern of demonization, as you mentioned in your intro, Emma, about Laurent Gbagbo was demonized, is happening also in East Africa. So there's a lot we can learn from each other's experience. We must constantly exchange information like that. So I refer to one good analyst, media analyst called Michel Collin from Belgium, Investigation. For war propaganda, I said there are 5 principles, how they use. And this pattern is used all over by imperialism, by neocolonialism, media propaganda, psychological warfare. Number 1, you hide history. So they always hide history. They only talk about the recent events, November. So they never will tell you the 27 years of tyrannical misrule of the Tplf. That historical background and context is always hidden by the media. The second is obscure the economic interest. Cote d'Ivoire, for example, or all over West Africa, France has huge economic interest. As once President of France, Jacques Chirac, said, without Africa, France would be a poor third-rate country, right? For every euro that France has, 60 cents come from Africa. From Cote d'Ivoire, from Mali, from Niger, from Gabon, from all this Francophonie Africa. Imperialism, neocolonialism operates in the same. The economic interests are hidden always. And thirdly, demonize. You demonize the leaders, the good leaders. If it's Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, or Nkrumah in Ghana, or Sékou Touré in Guinea, or Amilcar Cabral, or Patrice Lumumba, you remember way back in Congo, who was assassinated, visionary leader, or Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea. These kind of visionary leaders, or Laurent Gbagbo also, is, to my reading, I don't know much, but I know at least when Western media demonizes an African leader, that leader is doing good, it means. When Western media demonizes Abiy Ahmed Ali in Ethiopia, automatically Africans should say, oh, this is a good leader. So we must decolonize our mind from this Western propaganda and see these patterns. So demonization operates all over. Number 4, as I mentioned before, is inverting the victim and aggressor. They always do that. So the one who is been victimized, who is defending himself or herself from aggression, the victim becomes the aggressor, and the aggressor becomes the victim. So this inversion always operates in war propaganda, psychological warfare of the Western media. And number 5, of course, total information dominance, monopoly of news. So no alternative news or truth is allowed to come in the Western media. So you will have CNN, Agence France Presse, Deutsche Welle, BBC, and what have you. All this vast network of Western media sings the same song. Aksum Massacre, Aksum Massacre. It's a manufactured genocide in Tigray. The famine situation, the Ethiopian government is portrayed as committing, as deliberately starving the poor people of Tigray. It is the opposite is true. It is the Tplf who's holding the people of Tigray hijacked. It is the Tplf who's committing massive atrocities in the Amhara region, for example, in the Afar that it invaded recently. So much so that these atrocities became impossible to hide. Once again, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch had to reluctantly admit that atrocities are being committed by Tplf soldiers in Amhara, in Afar, and so on and so forth. But because the Western mainstream media is so huge and so vast, and it operates 24/7, it's like a huge machine. So we in Africa do not have media like that to fight for us. Unfortunately, the only avenues we have are small alternative medias like yours, for example, and NTV. What we're doing, this program, is trying to counter the disinformation network. But this is the pattern that has been happening. In this regard, I think you must invite one very brilliant young Eritrean called Dr. Simon Tesfamariam of the New Africa Institute. He had documented in 70 pages, well-researched, how the disinformation has been operating the past 14 months in Tigray. He called his paper Disinformation in Tigray, Manufacturing Consent for a Secessionist War. So point by point, he debunks all this disinformation by CNN's Ni'ma al-Baghr, by all these actors that you have mentioned, Alex de Waal, the British guy at Tufts University with his World Peace Federation. Alex de Waal has been for decades the advisor of Meles Zenawi. He is in cahoots with the Tplf. He is guilty of, by association, of all the crimes that Tplf committed in Ethiopia. But now, of course, he's in a position and he's an expert in propaganda. He constantly is brought in BBC as expert, in other media channels, to give false narrative and disinformation. There are others that my sister Azeb mentioned, such as the Norwegian Kjetil Tronvoll, such as the Dutch Holland woman called Miriam van Ruysen, International Crisis Group William Davison. I mean, they're legion. There are so many operating, and they're getting paid. How? Well, as we mentioned before, in its 27 years of tyrannical misrule, the Tplf was a kleptocratic regime. Africa had never witnessed such level of kleptocracy. Some say like Mobutu in Zaire. Mobutu was, what he stole from Zaire is a child's play. It was only $5 billion. In fact, to some degree, Mobutu was a nationalist. He constructed universities, and so on and so forth. The Tplf stole from Ethiopia, I would say, $70 billion. So where is this money? It is, of course, in Western banks. Now it is using this money to buy influence, to buy reporters. You have a notorious case is the CNN reporter Ni'am al-Baghr. She's Sudanese by origin, but a blackface doing the dirty work for imperialism's propaganda network, CNN. She manufactures news. She amplifies the Tigray genocide, rape of women. That never happened in Tigray by Ethiopian soldiers or Eritrean soldiers. But because it's CNN, it is given like credibility. So this is how the disinformation network has been operating. And eventually, in the end, then this is brought as sort of evidence, and the Western governments, the United States, bring it to the United Nations in order to paint the Ethiopian government as committing atrocities. Therefore, humanitarian intervention is warranted. That's how they operate. That's how they did it in Libya, for example, in 2011. They constantly use propaganda, amnesty, fake reports. Gaddafi is bringing African mercenaries to commit rapes on poor Arab women, massacres that never happened. Eventually, they took this case to the United Nations. Unfortunately, at that time, China and Russia were asleep, so they slipped it in. Through that, then NATO intervened, and what happened in Libya. Libya is now what? It's a destroyed country, totally destroyed. It will take it decades to recover from the devastation. But this is how their so-called humanitarian intervention, their so-called responsibility to protect doctrine operates. They manufacture crisis, and then they justify intervention to do what they want, to destroy nations or to bring about regime change and so on and so forth.
No, excellent. Actually, we told Michel Collin to listen to this. Pierre Ima is a very good friend of his.
Yes,
Samu,
he's
he's
looking
my hero.
this,
He's a very brilliant
he's looking
analyst in
this emission now.
He's watching us.
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe, I don't know. We told him.
very
But
happy that
Michel
he's watching.
Collin, he
We learned
writes
a lot from him.
Yes, he writes a book, Libye and Média Mensonges.
Yes.
To tell about fake news,
Great guy. He has done a documentary on Eritrea, in fact, Eritrea Come and See, which is also in French and in English that one time perhaps you can share about it.
Right.
Oh, we should have another program with him on.
Yes.
That would be interesting.
He want to note, he write me after, just beyond the emission, he tell me he want to know a lot of about Amara and Afar massacre, he tell.
Okay, sure.
So, je dis en français, donc vite, qu'on peut apprendre beaucoup entre l'Afrique de l'Ouest et l'Afrique de l'Est, parce que vraiment, on a beaucoup de choses à apprendre.
Tout à fait.
Des choses qui se répètent. Et Elias Amare nous donne l'exemple de Michel Collin, qui avait bien parlé de la guerre, de la propagande.
Propaganda, dans le livre.
Et comment l'on l'utilise, comme par exemple, la première chose qu'on fait, c'est qu'on cache l'histoire. Et donc, on met toujours l'histoire hors de contexte, non? Donc, on ne donne jamais le contexte de quel on parle. La deuxième chose qu'on cache vraiment, qui est toujours très obscure, c'est les intérêts économiques, non? Et donc, comme par exemple, Barre nous rappelle que Chirac avait dit que pour chaque euro, il y en avait quand même 60 centimes qui venaient de l'Afrique. Après, une autre chose, donc vraiment, on ne dit jamais les intérêts économiques, les ressources naturelles, on n'en parle jamais.
Tout à fait.
Après, on démonise les bons leaders. Donc, on l'a vu dans l'histoire, on parle de Gbagbo, du président de l'Érythrée aujourd'hui, de Nkrumah, de Lumumba. Tous les grands leaders africains ont été vraiment...
Don't forget Thomas Sankara.
Yes.
Sankara, today, Mali, you know. And, donc, on débolise.
Et surtout, actuellement, Modibo Keïta pour le Mali qu'ils ont dégommé.
Oui, vraiment. Et après, donc, Elias Amara nous suggère de décoloniser notre cerveau, de sortir de cette... parce qu'ils arrivent vraiment aussi, une autre chose qu'ils font tout le temps, c'est de invertir ce qui est la victime et l'agresseur, non? Et c'est toujours une chose qu'on voit tout le temps. Et après, bon, c'est aussi parce qu'ils dominent dans une manière très forte, ils sont tentaculaires, on voit qu'ils répètent la même chose, donc on voit que AFP, BBC, Deutsche Welle, ça vont être vraiment, et ils répètent les mêmes choses. Dans le cas ici, on a même parlé de génocide dans la région Tigré quand il n'y en avait pas, hein, mais c'était vraiment pour inciter à une intervention militaire. C'est un peu ça le but. Et donc, je vois ici que, donc, même, et naturellement, c'est une énorme machine qui marche 24 heures sur 7. Donc, comment s'opposer à tout ça? Et c'est très difficile à faire. Donc, c'est juste avec des petites chaînes comme nous, comme notre chaîne, qui essaye de contraster cette énorme désinformation. Et par rapport à cette crise-là, il y a un rapport magnifique de Simon, how is his last name?
Simon Tesfamariam.
Tesfamariam, un magnifique
The
rapport.
New Africa Institute.
Du nouveau Africa Institute, c'est un rapport fantastique. Je l'ai lu 3 fois parce que c'est tellement riche d'informations et c'est sur la désinformation dans cette dernière crise. Et il analyse vraiment toutes les mots-clés, toutes les instances, les réseaux qu'ils ont et il fait vraiment une analyse très pointue de la désinformation dans les premières 2 ans de la guerre. Et
in fact, some comrades of Michel Collot are translating it into French. Hopefully, it is finished by now. So we will try to share it with you, with the audience.
C'est magnifique. Donc, on vient de savoir que Michel Collot est en train de traduire ce papier qui est magnifique en français. Donc, ce sera aussi disponible pour un public qui lit seulement le français. Et donc, on voit par exemple que le personnage qu'on a montré là dans la vidéo qui carrément parle d'une guerre juste, que cette guerre de Tplf, c'est la seule guerre juste. Bon, c'était carrément la personne qui donnait qui était à côté de Meles Zenawi, qui est l'un des leaders du Tplf pendant des années. Donc, lui, vraiment, il devrait être aussi coupable par association.
Bien sûr.
Parce qu'il a passé toutes ces années-là. On a d'autres noms comme Van Rijssen, un groupe terrible qui fait beaucoup de travail dans la désinformation, c'est International Crisis Group.
Martin Plaut in UK.
Martin Plaut, j'ai vu celui-là, Trovar, le Norvégien, un Norvégien aussi que j'ai vu souvent mentionné. Et ça c'est terrible parce que dans le cas vraiment de l'Éthiopie, ils ont beaucoup volé, même plus selon Amara que Mobutu, qui avait quand même une vision nationaliste, qui avait construit quand même des maisons, des appartements, des maisons, des universités. Il n'était pas comme un régime kleptocratique au niveau de celui de l'Éthiopie, non? Et donc Et on a aussi, par exemple, une reporter du CNN, I don't remember her name, mais I know.
Nirma al-Bakr. Nirma al-Bakr.
Yeah.
Nirma Albak.
Et elle
Yeah.
est.
Sudanese of
elle est,
origin, but
elle est
very
nigériane,
notorious liar.
donc elle est noire, donc ça passe comme image et on l'utilise beaucoup, beaucoup. Elle a fabriqué des histoires incroyables sur cette dernière crise. Et bon, c'est plus ou moins et ce qu'on voit aussi, ce qu'on voit aussi dans le cas de la Libye, où on a vu que in Libya they actually said that that he was giving Viagra to his soldiers. That it's such a stupid story.
Incredible liars.
En Libye, ils avaient dit qu'on avait donné que Gaddafi donnait du Viagra aux soldats et tout ça naturellement pour fabriquer, pour après faire un changement de régime. C'est ça un peu le but de tout ça, malheureusement. And I hope you are not tired. If it's too late.
No, not at all. I'm fine, but I don't know. Perhaps it's late for our sister Aster.
Aster, you okay? I think with the
Ok, on arrive dans la partie de la psychologie maintenant. Je te laisse introduire en anglais, Nikki.
Okay, so we have something on psyops. The most outrageous psyops in the case of Ivory Coast was perhaps Bouaké, an event which saw 9 French soldiers and an American killed in the bombing of a French military base in Ivory Coast in 2004. The incident was blamed on Gbagbo. The entire Ivorian aircraft was destroyed and an arms embargo followed. Also, 2 crime incidents in the post-election crisis, the shooting of women during a march and the shelling of a market, were also blamed on Gbagbo. But 9 years of evidence at trial proved the accusations were wrong. What PSYOP operations can you think of in this crisis? Amara, if you maybe want to answer.
Donc, les opérations psychologiques de déstabilisation. Donc, le PSYOPS le plus scandaleux dans le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire était peut-être Bouaké. Un événement qui a vu 9 soldats français et un Américain tués dans le bombardement d'une base militaire française en Côte d'Ivoire. L'incident a été imputé à Gbagbo. L'ensemble de l'aviation militaire de la Côte d'Ivoire a été détruit et un embargo sur les armes a suivi. 2 incidents criminels dans la crise post-électorale, l'assassinat de femmes dans une marche et le bombardement d'un marché ont également été imputés à Gbagbo, mais encore une fois, 9 ans de preuves au procès, 9 ans de preuves au procès ont prouvé que l'accusation était fausse. Donc, la question, c'est quel type d'opération psychologique de déstabilisation, de manipulation ont-ils utilisé dans la crise en Éthiopie, au Tigré et en Érythrée? Voilà.
Which you want to answer? Aster, you want to answer?
I think this question is connected to what we have been discussing earlier. The fabrication of fake news and disinformation and the effects that the disinformation and fake news have. Regarding the conflict and the Ethiopian situation, we could say that the fake news and the disinformations that have been produced, as we said, by the international media, by different scholars and newspapers, the impact was, as I mentioned before, it has highly damaged or considerably damaged the prestige of Ethiopia and the Ethiopian government. In fact, these informations have, as we said, transformed the victim into aggressor. So Ethiopia was presented in the international global media as the aggressor, as a warmongering the country. And a number of examples could be mentioned. Some of them we have mentioned them before. For example, the fact that the Ethiopian military has bombed the Magale University. The other example we mentioned, that is killing that took place in Aksum. And there are a number of examples that we could mention now. For example, the fact that the Amhara special forces also were transformed in aggressors in this conflict. We know that the Amhara special forces had helped the Ethiopian Defense Force after the attack on November 4, 2020. But after helping the national Ethiopian forces, the Amhara special forces never crossed the Tigrian border. They remained within the Amhara territory. But we have seen that the diplomats, Western diplomats, international journalists have requested the Ethiopian government to withdraw its troops. But they have also requested that the Amhara special forces have to be withdrawn from Tigray. These are some of the other examples. And one of the recent issue that mentioned in relation to this is, for example, that the Tplf was quite new to Addis Ababa, and many Western diplomats and particularly the CNN have repeatedly said that within a few days that the Tplf will be occupying Addis Ababa. In relation to this, the American embassy in Addis has made a number of appeals to its citizens. It has appealed its citizens to leave the capital city of Ethiopia. At the same time, it has appealed to would-be tourists into Ethiopia not to come to Ethiopia. I remember the American embassy also was willing, expressed that its willingness to give some kind of financial aid to those American citizens who didn't have the capacity to buy airplane tickets to go back to their country. And these are some of the examples that had some kind of direct and indirect impact on the politics of Ethiopia and on the government of Ethiopia.
Non, donc beaucoup des questions on avait déjà justement traité avant sous la question des fausses médias, parce qu'effectivement c'est une manipulation. Donc pour ceux qui on a discuté déjà sur la question d'Aksum par exemple, ou l'attaque de l'université, ou même on a fait semblant que le groupe des forces spéciales des Amhara étaient eux les agresseurs, quand eux en réalité ils accompagnaient simplement l'armée nationale dans la guerre. Donc, mais on les avait vraiment ciblés, on avait même demandé à eux de se retirer du conflit quand ils étaient en train de protéger leur région. Donc c'était une chose vraiment très bizarre. Et donc, et même aussi une autre chose un peu de déstabilisation psychologique, c'était que même si c'est effectivement la guerre, ils étaient avancés vers Addis Ababa, mais ils n'étaient pas vraiment dans la ville. Tous les journaux avaient écrit qu'il fallait quitter le pays, que les touristes ne devaient pas y aller. C'était un peu une manière aussi de pousser à cet changement, voilà, à donner une déstabilisation au pays, non? Parce que tu te sens très déstabilisé comme pays si à un certain moment tous les journaux disent quittez le pays, il faut laisser, donc un peu comme on fait en Ukraine maintenant, mais bon, ça on le voit. Bon, et I don't know, Elias, if you have something else to say on the PSYOPs or...
Well, perhaps to add to debunk these false narratives that notorious false narratives such as the Aksum Massacre that never happened, and it's blamed on Eritrean troops. One, the stories constantly keep changing. For example, an Amnesty report came out. I forget whether it's Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, one of the two anyway, that the massacre in this Tigrayan city called Aksum, which is a historic ancient city, happened on November 28, 29, 30. But fortunately, November 29 of 2020 was the religious holiday, sacred holiday of the patron saint of that city, Saint Mary of Zion. So Ethiopian television covered this event, this celebration. Normally, almost over 1 million Ethiopians from all over Ethiopia come as pilgrims to visit during this holiday. But during that time, because of the war situation, the number of celebrants was only in the hundreds of thousands. So the witnesses, the Tigrayan civilians, said, no, everything is peaceful. The only thing is that unlike previous years where we had over 1 million visitors, this year the number was only 100,000 due to the war situation. Other than that, nothing has happened. So this was on record. So how is it that they missed it? This Aksum massacre that's supposed to happen, in which 800 civilians were massacred by Eritrean soldiers, the residents of the city of Aksum never mentioned it. There are other credible witnesses who debunked it, but still, this the stories keep changing. The falsehoods, when one lie is exposed, another lie is brought forward, and so on and so forth. And this is how it operates. The other case is one of a young Tigrayan lady called Mona Lisa Abraha, who claimed first she came out and said it was Ethiopian soldiers who cut her arm and raped her. And then a few weeks later, the story changed and says, oh no, it was Eritrean soldiers. Finally, her father, who lives abroad, said, no, I've been calling and, they were hiding from me. She was a militia. So, she was wounded in battle, and unfortunately, she lost her arm and leg, I think. But the rape story was fake. These kinds of fake stories are repeated over and over again. Another thing, when the Tplf was defeated and as it withdrew from Mekelle, the capital city, and fled to the countryside, to the bushes, it released from the prisons of Mekelle and other cities of Tigray 13,100 hardened criminals, some of them rapists. It released them and let them loose on the civilians of Tigray, knowing that this would commit crimes. In fact, it dressed them up as it gave them uniforms of Ethiopian army, Eritrean army, because it had a textile factory called Almeda Charka Chark, a big textile factory that produced uniforms in previous years for Ethiopian army, and they had also, for some reason, been producing Eritrean army uniforms. So this released thousands of prisoners were dressed up as soldiers, and they were let loose on the civilians. So for weeks, Tigray was in chaos from these hardened criminals committing all kinds of crimes on the civilians, rapes, and so on and so forth. In fact, in the capital city of Mekelle, for a brief time, law and order had disintegrated, and it was a situation of chaos until the Ethiopian army came and restored order. So the crimes committed by these criminal elements then was blamed on either Ethiopian soldiers or Eritrean soldiers. So you have many such kind of psyops, false flag operations, massacres that never happened or that were dramatized on picture. The CNN reporter Naim Al-Baghr, for example, used one such video footage whose authenticity cannot be verified. They dress some of their soldiers as Ethiopian soldiers, and you see them shooting captured civilians. But these are the false flag operations, the psyops that then the Western human rights organizations and the Western media take as as gospel truth, and amplify them, and so on and so forth. The other thing, as Aster mentioned, was in around October of last year, the Tplf had made advances southwards and to Wollo and to Dessie and Kombolcha cities. So while it was still far away from Addis Ababa, about 300 kilometers away to the north, the Western media such as CNN were presenting stories as if they were in the suburbs of Addis Ababa, 10 kilometers or 15 kilometers outside Addis Ababa, knocking at the gates of Addis Ababa, that they would enter Addis Ababa anytime soon. This was done deliberately as a psychological warfare to create panic in the city of Addis Ababa. In fact, the American embassy was issuing warnings and putting pressure on other embassies. Some African embassies, such as Zambian embassy, withdrew its staff from Addis Ababa around that time. So all this was a psyop to create panic in the residents of Addis Ababa and also in the diplomatic corps. You have to take into consideration that Addis Ababa is the seat of the African Union. So you have a huge number of diplomats there. What they wanted to create was a panic situation where these diplomats would flee the country. And so, a sort of regime change could be created then from within the city, because also at the same time, the Tplf and other terrorist elements had infiltrated into the city, tens of thousands of armed combatants waiting in the wings for a signal to create a situation of chaos in the capital city of Addis Ababa. So this kind of psychological warfare, psyops, with the complicity of the Western embassies, notorious of this was the US embassy in Addis Ababa, the Western media such as CNN, BBC, were creating this type of falsehood, false stories, as if the enemy, the Tplf, was literally knocking at the gates of Addis Ababa and would enter Addis Ababa anytime. Never happened. They were far away, at least 300 kilometers far from Addis Ababa. And within weeks, in fact, once the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, as Commander-in-Chief, took charge and went to the battlefront, they were routed, defeated severely, and fled helter-skelter back to Tigray, where they are confined now. But still, even now, they are committing atrocities in Afar, in Raya area of Amhara. And so, this kind of psyops continue with the complicity of Western media.
Ok, donc je fais brièvement, par exemple, dans le massacre, soi-disant massacre de Aksum, c'est assez bizarre parce qu'ils avaient donné plusieurs dates différentes. Mais dans cette période-là, il y a une fête religieuse très très connue en Éthiopie où normalement il y a 1 million de personnes qui participent. Mais cette période-là, il y en avait quand même des centaines de milliers qui ont participé. Donc il y avait des images télévision, il y avait des images quand même de tout ça. Et donc comment est-ce qu'il aurait pu avoir un massacre si ils étaient en train de fêter leur grande fête religieuse. Donc, et ils avaient dit que c'était un massacre de 800 personnes, donc c'est pas possible que ça aurait pu avoir lieu et en même temps il y avait une fête religieuse. Donc ça c'était l'un des exemples. Ou par exemple on avait aussi une autre dame dont je connais pas l'histoire, elle s'appelait Mona Lisa
Abrahaya.
Et elle avait dit au début qu'elle avait été violée par des Éthiopiens, puis elle avait changé son histoire, elle avait dit non, c'était des Érythréens, et c'est incroyable parce qu'effectivement, elle faisait partie de milice, donc même si c'est vrai qu'elle a été quand même blessée, c'est pas que le fait qu'elle a vraiment eu du mal quand même, mais c'était pas vrai l'histoire qu'elle racontait. Donc c'est un peu ça. L'autre chose terrible que Elias Amare nous raconte, c'est que quand même je crois que c'était vers juin, quand le gouvernement avait repris la ville, était en train de reprendre la ville de Tigray au nord. Ils ont libéré 13 000 criminels dans des prisons et leur même donné des uniformes, des fois des militaires, parce qu'il y a une fabrique là dans la région qui fabrique carrément tous les uniformes de l'armée nationale. Et donc, ils leur ont donné, ils les ont laissés libres pour faire ce qu'ils voulaient. Donc, il avait vraiment une période de non-loi dans cette région qui était assez terrible. Et là, j'avais encore, et par exemple aussi, oui, et après l'autre dont on avait parlé, ce qu'on avait dit aussi qu'ils étaient très près de la ville. Par exemple, oui, ils étaient à 300-400 kilomètres de la ville, de la capitale, mais déjà toutes les ambassades, spécialement l'ambassade américaine en particulier, disaient ils sont presque entrés dans la ville. Et c'est vraiment une manière pour créer de la panique dans la ville, de déstabiliser le pays et aussi dedans de rendre les gens pas sûrs, non.
Et surtout de faire trembler les diplomaties qui sont à la capitale d'Addis.
Voilà.
Les diplomates des pays occidentaux, pour qu'eux, ils puissent partir pour dire que vraiment...
parce que c'est le siège de l'Union africaine.
De l'Union africaine,
donc,
oui.
Avoir ça, non, faire partir les diplomates, ça aurait vraiment causé. Donc, c'est vraiment une manière très efficace de leur part. Voilà, après, à travers les médias, ils reprennent tout ça et voilà, c'est vraiment des opérations de déstabilisation.
Psychologique, et ça marche, parce qu'en tant qu'être humain, ça marche beaucoup, la déstabilisation psychologique.
Oui.
Le rôle de l'ONU.
Le rôle de l'ONU. The role of the UN.
As a footnote here, the Zambian embassy, when it withdrew its staff, about 20 some from Addis Ababa, a few days before, USAID, Samantha Power had met with the president of Zambia, and USAID had given generously some millions of dollars. Of course, it's a reward, a quid pro quo type of thing. You see the connection? Yes. Shamefully, Zambia had to cooperate in such. Fortunately, it was only Zambia who participated in this shameful thing.
I think it was also Germany. No,
that goes without saying. The Western
some of the Western.
I'm talking about African.
Donc, le seul pays africain qui avait participé à cette retire des diplomates, c'était la Zambie. Toi, tu as compris, non? Mais tu peux traduire. Non, parce qu'effectivement, tu traduis mieux que moi.
La Zambie, oui, ils ont donné beaucoup d'argent au pays pour pouvoir, voilà, essayer d'avoir les gens avec l'argent. Et cela se passe en ce moment au Burkina Faso. L'ambassadeur de la France a reçu de l'argent au Burkina Faso. Il a convoqué les associations de jeunes burkinabés de venir prendre de l'argent pour faire marcher leurs associations. Là, en ce moment, Afrique Média en a parlé il y a la semaine dernière. Et au Mali, ils sont en train de financer l'opposition contre le gouvernement en place. Donc, c'est vrai que les Occidentaux, ils déstabilisent psychologiquement, ils déstabilisent financièrement aussi. Parce qu'ils ont de l'argent à donner aux soi-disant opposants, ils créent des oppositions, et avec cet argent, les gens font de la corruption pour essayer de rassembler des gens en masse dans la ville contre le gouvernement en place. Le gouvernement souverain suivi par le peuple malien. Donc, ce que dit Elias est très vrai. Il passe par tous les moyens psychologiques et le moyen financier. C'est le cas de la Zambie.
She's underlining that the same thing is happening in Burkina Faso now, where they're financing the opposition right now.
I understood a little bit.
And so they destabilize also financially, not only psychologically, not only with media, but also a lot of money is involved. Bon, c'est vraiment grave.
Mais il faut le dénoncer comme on fait ce soir. Voilà.
Oui, but we must denounce it like we are doing tonight. Yes. So our next question will be, the role of the UN. So, for example, in 2011, Ivory Coast suffered multiple sanctions from EU, ECOWAS, the West African Monetary Union, as well as the United Nations, making the management of the country extremely difficult. The EU sanctions targeted over 80 people from Gbagbo's political party, the Ivorian Popular Front. And these sanctions were not lifted for 8 years. In addition to financial sanctions, the closure of the borders, ports, and airports massively contributed to the increase in deaths. As, for example, hospitals lacked medicine. 45,000 people lost their lives since 2002, and up to 16,000 in the 2010-11 war. My question for Aster is the costs that we know so far. Oh, no, excuse me. What am I? What is?
What's the role of the United Nations?
What is the role of the United Nations? Oh, I'm sorry. I mixed something up because we are. I'm actually meant to say that in 2011 in Côte d'Ivoire, sorry, we'll just skip the next one. That in 2011 in Ivory Coast, it has been coined as a French UN regime change. Disinformation was also spread by the UN during the post-election crisis. For example, they said that there were mass graves that were found and that were attributed to the Gbagbo government, a fact that the UN then retracted only at the end of the crisis. A UN report in 2012 was so full of factual errors that various intellectuals in the Ivorian diaspora and exile actually responded point by point, providing factual evidence that the allegations were bogus. So a very, very biased position on the part of the UN. What was the role of the United Nations in this specific crisis?
I think since the war started in Ethiopia, the relationship between the United Nations and the Ethiopian government have not been idyllic, and there are many factors for this contradiction and tension between the two. One of them was, for example, if you remember, the case of Ethiopia has been several times presented in the UN Security Council to be discussed regarding the human rights violations and other issues. This has created some kind of rejection on the part of the Ethiopian government. And these meetings that were held by the Security Council of the United Nations, Ethiopia got some kind of support from countries like Russia, China, India, and others. Moreover, another source of tension between the United Nations and Ethiopia was the case, if you remember, that Ethiopia decided to expel 5 important figures of the United Nations from Ethiopia. Ethiopia expelled this UN personnel, accusing them of spreading disinformation, and at the same time, because they, according to the Ethiopian government, these UN personnel were diverting humanitarian aid to the Tplf, and moreover, that they have given some telecommunication devices to the Tplf. And this has further increased the contradiction between the United Nations and the Ethiopian government. In addition to this, related to the UN, is the case of the vehicles which used to transport humanitarian aid to Tigray region. We remember that hundreds of vehicles that were transporting the humanitarian aid to Tigray never returned to Ethiopia. And this has been also a source of contrast between Ethiopia and the United Nations organization. We then later saw that these very vehicles that were used to transport humanitarian aid to Tigray were used by the Tplf to transport fighters, Tplf fighters, into the regions, two regions of Afar and Amhara. And lastly, one of the factors that have caused some kind of friction between the United Nations organization and the Ethiopian government was the decision of the UN Council for Human Rights to hold a meeting. You remember there was a meeting, and in this meeting, the focal point of discussion was the violation of human rights in Ethiopia, especially related to the conflict. And the holding of this meeting has been highly contrasted by the Ethiopian government because before the meeting of the UN Council for Human Rights, there was a joint report by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. These two organizations said that they have investigated for months, and they produced a joint report regarding the violations of human rights in Tigray. In this report, the two organizations stated that all groups were involved in the Tigrayan conflict were somehow responsible for the violation of human rights. These groups were, in fact, the Ethiopian government and the Eritrean troops, and as well as the Tplf. In spite of the fact that there was this report that was produced by these two groups, that by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Commission for Human Rights of the United Nations, the UN Council for Human Rights decided to hold the meeting. And in this meeting, it was decided that it would be necessary to form another independent commission that would investigate on the violation of human rights in Ethiopia. All these factors put together have created some kind of contrast and contradiction between the UN and the Ethiopian government. Nowadays, things seem to change, and there seems some kind of improvement in the relations between the Ethiopian government and the United Nations, probably because there is a negotiation that is going on between the Ethiopian federal government and the Tplf.
Ok, donc la relation vraiment n'a pas été idyllique dans le cas, par exemple, bon, ils ont quand même été soutenus par des pays comme la Russie ou la Chine au niveau de Conseil de sécurité, mais par exemple, il y a même eu le fait qu'on a chassé 5 membres des Nations Unies. À l'époque, ils ont été chassés du pays parce qu'on les a trouvés qui donnaient soit de l'information technique, du matériel technique, ou ils soutenaient quand même le Tplf, et donc on leur avait demandé de quitter le pays. Mais c'était ça la raison, non? Aussi parce qu'ils faisaient de la fausse information. Comme on l'a vu aussi dans le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire avec les fausses communes, un peu ce genre de fausses informations. Mais après, il y a aussi une autre histoire très bizarre, c'est que les véhicules du PAM, donc de l'Agence des Nations Unies pour l'alimentation, ils ont carrément, la chose terrible, c'est que quand ils sont entrés, ils ne sont jamais retournés. Donc, on parle de plus de 400 camions qui sont partis vers le Tigré et qui ont après été utilisés par le Tplf pour faire la guerre. Donc, on voyait que de l'aide humanitaire était détournée dans ce sens-là. Et donc, ça aussi, ça a été dénoncé après par le PAM, mais pas nécessairement au début. Et la chose la plus bizarre, peut-être, c'est qu'il y a eu un rapport qui est sorti en novembre 2020 qui était en rapport avec l'Agence des Nations Unies et une agence des droits de l'homme, l'Agence des droits de l'homme des Nations Unies et une agence éthiopienne des droits de l'homme, et ils avaient fait un rapport qui était arrivé quand même à des conclusions là aussi un peu touchant sur les exactions des deux côtés, ce que moi personnellement j'appelle aussi une forme d'impérialisme, toujours de faux équivalence, selon moi. Ça, c'est moi qui le dis. Mais la chose terrible, c'est que même avec ce rapport qui est sorti, cette organisation des Nations Unies des droits de l'homme a dit non, il faut faire encore une autre investigation, il faut encore insister sur ça, et voilà. Et peut-être maintenant on va vers une relation meilleure, mais il faudrait voir. Et you want to add something or about the role of the UN? I think
maybe to emphasize that in this case, the role of the UN as an organization, an international organization, and its affiliated organizations such as WFP, the World Food Program, and also let's not forget WHO, the World Health Organization, have been abysmal. The United Nations is supposed to be neutral and does not interfere in the internal political affairs of countries. But all these norms of international law have been violated, thrown to the wayside, and the UN has been shown, as Sister Aster has amply enumerated, that it has been meddling in favor of this terrorist group Tplf, whether it is the WFP through its food aid. The US aid has also been complicit in this. They have essentially been feeding the war machine of the Tplf under the guise of famine aid. So a Canadian journalist by the name of Jeff Pierce had gone to Ethiopia and interviewed two UN staff women, one African and the other one I think is Asian. So they confessed to him how their work has been compromised, how some UN staff have been, meddling in the cases of internal politics, siding with the Tplf, and forcing the UN staff to inflate figures of famine victims in Tigra. So if it was, if the estimation, let's say, was that there are 50,000 vulnerable population in Tigray that need food assistance, the UN, through the pressure coming from Geneva, from WHO, some UN staff were forcing them to inflate the figure to say 200,000 or 300,000 population. By doing this, they would then send massive food aid, and this food aid would feed the combatants of the Tplf. In fact, many captured Tplf soldiers were found in their pockets with rations clearly designated as US aid energy biscuits, and what have you, which were supposed to go to malnourished children. But it was the Tplf soldiers who were getting fed by this. So this is typical of what I call feeding the Tplf war machine. The United Nations was complicit in this crime. So was the USAID. So was the WHO. Let's not forget. The head of WHO, the World Health Organization, is one called Dr. Tedros Adhanom, a former Tplf leader who at one time was in Ethiopia the health minister. While he was health minister in Ethiopia, for example, he hid a cholera epidemic that was happening in Ethiopia at that time. I think it was around 2005, and pressured the health officers in Ethiopia to call it, instead of cholera, acute watery diarrhea. Why? So that his regime would benefit from tourism. If it's a case of cholera epidemic, the number of tourists visiting Ethiopia would decline, right? So this notorious guy in 2017 becomes the Director General of World Health Organization. As World Health Organization Director, he's not supposed to meddle in internal political affairs of countries, because the internal rules and regulations of United Nations prohibit the bureaucrats, the UN staff, from involving themselves in political affairs of nations. But Tedros Adhanom was notorious in meddling in Ethiopian case, in this case, siding with his Tplf buddies and giving them all kind of help, pressuring UN staff in Ethiopia to do all kinds of things. So to emphasize, the United Nations has been so thoroughly compromised and its role has been so shameful. They've been trying to manufacture crisis. They brought the case of Ethiopia 10 times to the UN Security Council. But thanks to Russia, to China, and a few other countries, India, they could not pass any resolution against Ethiopia or Eritrea because the Russians and Chinese were wiser this time around. Remember, in 2011, they were fooled. So they were saying, yeah, for you fool us once, shame, shame on you, but you fool us twice, it will be shame on us. So they were alert, and thankfully, they prevented, they used their no vote. If these two countries vote no, it becomes a veto. Huh? So the United States and the European allies could not pass the resolution against Ethiopia that they wanted. So they resorted then to unilateral sanctions measure. So the United States has put sanctions on Eritrea. It is now also threatening through a congressional resolution, which is still at the committee level, HR 6600, it's called, House resolution. And it threatens sanction on Ethiopia and Eritrea to be intensified. So it's this kind of things. The UN has been complicit and has been a tool, essentially, of the United States and Western governments in this war, openly siding with the Tplf.
Donc, on peut dire vraiment que les Nations Unies ont vraiment pris parti dans cette guerre aux côtés de Tplf. On peut le voir à travers toutes les agences, hein, donc le PAM, l'Organisation mondiale de la santé, et dans ce cas, USAID aussi, l'agence, bon, ça c'est une agence américaine et ils ont, il y a par exemple un journaliste canadien qui s'appelle Jeff Pierce qui a fait un bon travail. Il a interviewé des membres des Nations Unies qui ont vraiment parlé de l'ingérence, de comment on leur mettait de la pression, d'agir, de dire certaines choses, ils n'étaient pas libres, et ils ont vraiment parlé de leur difficulté de travailler dans une manière neutrale, ce qu'ils devraient faire en théorie.
And by the way, these two courageous women, UN staff in Ethiopia, are now punished for whistleblowing, and they are suspended from their jobs. Because they told the truth. They exposed the dirty dealings of the United Nations.
Et donc, ces deux dames, aujourd'hui, ils ont même été suspendus des Nations Unies pour avoir parlé et dit la vérité de ce qui se passait, au lieu d'avoir que quelqu'un les prend. Non, et donc, il y a quand même, par exemple, une autre chose qu'on fait beaucoup, c'est de gonfler les numéros. Et Elias Amar nous souligne quand même que pour lui, c'est une manière de nourrir la guerre, non? Parce que on dit par exemple qu'il y a, au lieu de 50 000, on dit qu'il y a 200 000 personnes qui ont besoin d'aide humanitaire, et cette aide vient après déflecter, et cette aide va vers le Tplf au lieu d'aller vers les gens qui en ont vraiment besoin. C'est une manière aussi d'alimenter la guerre. Et la chose la plus terrible de tout, c'est que le chef de l'OMS aujourd'hui, Tedros, donc, qui suit encore l'histoire, ça c'est moi, c'est pas Elias qui dit ça, qui suit encore l'histoire du Covid est malade parce que dans le sens qu'il faut voir que ça aussi c'est une arnaque, l'histoire du Covid, parce qu'on a à la tête aujourd'hui de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé quelqu'un comme Tedros qui quand même était un ministre de la santé en Éthiopie, et quand il était ministre, il avait même caché en 2005 au monde qu'il y avait une grave crise de choléra dans le pays, et il avait fait semblant qu'il n'y en avait pas Pourquoi? Parce qu'il voulait quand même que les touristes continuent à arriver. Donc, il avait dit, ah non, c'est juste un problème de diarrhée, un petit problème de... Il avait carrément caché ça. Donc, ça, c'est la personne qui maintenant est à la tête de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé. Et donc, lui aussi, par exemple, il n'a pas du tout dénoncé toutes les exactions dans les autres régions des hôpitaux et tout ça, mais il a juste parlé non, et pris le côté du Tplf, ce qu'un membre des Nations Unies ne devrait pas faire, parce qu'il devrait quand même avoir un rôle neutre. Donc, les Nations Unies, dans ce cas, ont été très compromis, vraiment très, très compromis. Et plus ou moins, c'est ça que j'ai couvert. Et non, bon, on parlait aussi du fait que, oui, que pratiquement, on a même cherché de faire une résolution. Donc, on a amené 10 fois la crise au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. Mais cette fois-ci, la Russie et l'Inde, ou bien la Russie quand même et la Chine ont mis le veto là-dessus parce qu'ils se sont dit, bon, on a été trompé déjà pour la Libye en 2011 et là maintenant on ne va pas répéter la même erreur, et donc heureusement que ces résolutions-là ont été stoppées, mais quand même c'est pour ça qu'ils ont maintenant fait des sanctions unilatérales, parce qu'ils n'ont pas pu les faire à travers les Nations Unies. Mais quand même un rôle très très néfaste.
Just to add a point that I forgot, by the way, this abuse of food aid as a political weapon is a long-standing tradition of the Tplf. During its days as rebels fighting against the Mengistu regime, I remember in 1984 was a terrible famine in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. During this time, the Tplf had used famine aid to advance its own political end. It was later exposed by the BBC, for example. Surprisingly, Martin Plaut wrote about it in BBC. If you Google search Martin Plaut, Tplf, food aid, you will find this article. It was written around 2010. So it is estimated that $100 million were the Tplf managed to get through food aid, and it only gave from this to the people of Tigray, to the starving famine victims, only $5 million. The rest, it used it to strengthen its organization and to buy weapons and what have you, 95 million. This was witnessed by one former leader of the Tplf, Aragawi Berhe, Dr. Aragawi Berhe, who later fell from grace and was expelled from the Tplf and went to the West. He's now, I think, back in Ethiopia. But he gave witness to this story that the Tplf had abused food aid and the famine to siphon off the money, the charity coming, and it almost stole like 95 million coming. This was supposed to go to the famine victims, but only a tiny percentage, 5% of this money or this food aid went to the famine victims. The rest went into strengthening the Tplf. This is how the Tplf strengthened itself. And when it came to power in 1991, it already had accumulated this amount of money in its war chest.
Donc, pour dire que déjà aussi dans la guerre contre Mengistu, eux, le Tplf, avaient déjà à l'époque s'approprié de l'argent qui était carrément pour les gens en famine, pour renforcer, même pour acheter des armes, pour se renforcer. Et là, on a même carrément un monsieur qui vient de l'interne du Tplf, qui s'appelle Aragawi Berhe, qui aujourd'hui est dans l'Occident, qui a quand même dénoncé tout ça, parce qu'aujourd'hui, il ne travaille plus avec eux. Et donc, eux, et il y a même un de nos personnages là qui aujourd'hui a vendu, le Martin Plaut, qui à l'époque quand même, parce que c'est il y a des décennies, il avait écrit sur ça. Donc, il devrait connaître la vraie nature de ce régime du Tplf, même si aujourd'hui il écrit autre chose. Thank you. Now we just move on to some of the last questions, which now a big question that we have is, for example, the costs of this war. You know, we saw that, I read you before, that the cost of the war in Ivory Coast was huge, tremendous, with the sanctions and the loss of a lot of war. I asked Aster, what is the cost of the war that we know so far? And we also know that the war is actually ongoing, that despite the fact that the government of Abiy Ahmed says that that the war is over officially, there's one question I don't understand why he's not protecting some of the areas, because it seems to me like the war is ongoing. And what is happening? What are the costs that we know so far, and what is happening today? Because if the war has not finished, why has the government declared that it's over, when it is declaring, however, that the Tplf is still occupying the regions of Afar and Amara? I saw that from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs the other day. The costs in general.
And I would like to divide the talk in two phases. The first phase was what we have been speaking earlier. That is, the first phase is the Ethiopian federal forces waged the war against the Tplf and were able to reoccupy Mekelle within a period of 3 weeks. The second phase was, if you remember, the Ethiopian government made a unilateral ceasefire, decided to have a unilateral ceasefire. I think, if I remember well, it was around June. And after the Ethiopian government on a unilateral basis decided to stop the war against the Tplf forces started attacking the two regions confining Tigray. They are the Afar and the Amhara region. It was really a very devastating war, and it was really, I would call it a unique type of war, because it was a mass invasion. The Tplf arrived in these two regions, bringing hundreds and thousands of people. Most of the fighters of the Tplf, maybe not the majority, a part of the Tplf forces were composed of young people of the age of 12, 13, and 14. And the Amhara special forces, the militia, and the federal forces, the same thing in Afar, had to fight against people who were underage, as I mentioned before. And also, in this mass invasion, there were even old people of 70 and 80 years old. So it's a very specific kind of war that was waged against the two regions. And the effect of this second phase war was really devastating on the social and economic life of the Amhara and the Afar people. It has completely destroyed a number of hospitals, clinics, health centers, small and big businesses, private homes, pharmacies, universities have been totally devastated. And moreover, we have numbers, we have figures, but these figures, for me, they are highly underestimated, because as you mentioned before, the war is still going on. The Ethiopian government says that the conflict has stopped, but the war is going on in the Afar and Amhara region. So the number of devastation and the number of days and the economic impact of this war will be increasing in the future. Some months ago, the Afar administration declared that the Tplf destroyed around 60 medical centers and hospitals. The situation is even worse in the Amhara region. Thousands of schools, health centers, hospitals, universities have been totally destroyed. Moreover, there was a number of looting. The Tplf forces looted, for example, computers, technological devices from the universities and the schools. The farmers, ordinary farmers, Amhara farmers, and Afar farmers were looted of their agricultural products. The Tplf forces slaughtered tens and hundreds of domestic animals, some of them like the cows and sheep, goats. In Afar, they slaughtered camels. In Amhara region, they slaughtered donkeys. Not only some of these animals were like cows and sheep were eaten, were used for eating by the Tplf forces. But the strangest thing that happened, especially in the Amhara region, was that Tplf forces deliberately killed the animals without eating them. And this is really the strangest thing that one could witness in a war. They were simply killed because the ownership of these animals, the owners of these animals are Amharas. So even the killing of animals had an ethnic significance. Hence, the devastation is really incredible. Some time ago, the Amhara administration declared that the economic, the amount of economic devastation in Amhara reached around 5.7 billion American dollars. So, as I said before, I think even these estimates are going to increase in the future because the war is still going on. And recently, an Afar activist said that in Afar we have around 700,000 internally displaced people. In Amhara, there are around, I don't know, 1 million, 3 up 2 million people displaced in the Amhara region. Recently, as we said, that the war is going on, and within a few weeks, around 300,000 Afar people have been displaced. The Tplf has occupied around 5 waradas. Waradas are small administrative units. And in Amhara region, as was mentioned before, the Tplf is still present in Raya, in some zones, in some territories of Raya. For example, the Tplf is present in Adberkai, in Tamery, in a city called Forum. And it's trying to extend its aggression on a city a new city known as Popo. Recently, we have around 13,000 Raya people who have escaped the war that's being waged by the Tplf, and they are found now in the near city of Popo. Hence, the war is continuing, the damage is continuing. And the Tplf, for example, in the Afar region, destroyed the water wells, so that, and this has created a shortage of drinking water in the Afar region. And the war is still continuing, and the damage will be, I think, if the Ethiopian government doesn't decide to stop the military advance of the Tplf, the devastation in the future will be even more than what we have been describing now.
Ok, donc on a parlé des coûts de la guerre et la guerre qui malheureusement continue en ces jours-ci. Donc la chose terrible, c'est qu'on n'a pas vu, il y a eu deux phases. Donc il y a eu la première phase qui s'est arrêtée quand il y a eu quand même le cessez-le-feu unilatéral en juin 2020. mais tout après, le Tplf n'a pas respecté ce cesse-le-feu, et donc ils ont commencé à attaquer la région Afar et Amara. Et là, ils ont même pris des enfants, vraiment des gamins de 12, 13 ans, et des vieillards qu'ils ont pris pour les recruter pour faire cette guerre. Ils les mettaient un peu devant, non, comme des boucs, comment on peut les appeler en français, les gens qui en mettent devant, comme des
chairs à canon.
Voilà, des chairs à canon. Et ils ont vraiment, c'est une deuxième qui est devenue encore plus terrible, aussi parce qu'il n'y a pas le gouvernement en ce moment qui est en train de les protéger. Et la chose qu'on ne comprend pas aussi, c'est la nécessité, à part avoir vraiment détruit des hôpitaux, plus de 7000 entre centre, hôpital et toutes les écoles, mais ils ont aussi tout pris, tout cassé, comme vous voyez dans les images aussi, ça c'est les deux régions de Afar et Amara, et on a vraiment tout cassé, et la chose qu'on ne comprend pas, c'est aussi la nécessité de tuer les animaux, qui ont été mangés, de les laisser comme ça seulement parce que c'était des animaux qui étaient des Amaras. Et ça n'a vraiment aucune. Pour vous donner aussi une idée de la gravité de la situation, on a quand même 700 000 déplacés internes dans la région de Afar et 2 millions dans la région de Amara. Et donc vraiment des chiffres très très hauts de déplacés internes. Et juste dernièrement, il y a encore eu 300 000 qui sont déplacés d'une autre région parce qu'ils ont occupé des centres administratifs qui s'appellent les Woreda. Donc, en ce moment aussi, il y a vraiment beaucoup d'escapés encore, et la guerre est en train de continuer. Donc, on dit que ça s'est arrêté, mais ce n'est pas le cas. And I don't know. Oh, yes. My question for Elia here was, Ivory Coast under President Gbagbo was targeted also because of the autonomy of its financial management, known as secure budget management, namely to run the country only with its own revenue. President Gbagbo had decided not to borrow money from agencies such as the IMF and the World Bank. Eritrea has been scapegoated for decades and is also carrying a heavy cost in this war. Can you speak of, just very briefly, of the long war of independence fought basically alone, with little help from other countries, and the recent US sanctions imposed on the Eritrean government, which seem to be even harsher than the ones imposed on Ethiopia? You're muted.
I forgot I had muted myself. Yes, for many years during its liberation struggle and afterwards, Eritrea has been practicing self-reliance, rejecting foreign aid, rejecting this NGOs, charity handouts, dependency, and building the nation from the ground up through its own resources, focusing on agriculture, ensuring food security, building dams, and also to some extent agro-industry, which will then kick into industrialization. So it has been careful in rejecting foreign aid, as I said, and rejecting the IMF, World Bank, diktat, as Gbagbo had done in Cote d'Ivoire. And this is amply recorded. And it's for this, I think, that the West, especially imperialism, doesn't like this. Neocolonialism does not like this. Because if Africa starts to practice this all over, Africa will be free of aid dependency. So, development will start, agriculture, industrialization will take place in Africa. So this kind of example has to be crushed before it spreads elsewhere. That's why we have had, for 60 years almost now since independence, neocolonialism has been foisted, imposed on Africa. punishing leaders that are visionary, that want to have an independent economic, political line, real, genuine development. And so because of this, Eritrea was invaded by the Tplf regime in 1998. A war was ignited against it under the border context, pretext. And then later sanctions were imposed on it, economic warfare essentially, to effect regime change, to bring down the government. But the people rallied behind the government, and still standing. Eritrea still standing tall on its feet. It has not, succumbed. It has not been overthrown. On the contrary, it was the Tplf regime which had been so totally dependent on foreign aid, Western aid, that finally was overthrown. Ethiopia, under the reformist government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, also was beginning some moves towards independence, economic independence, to produce its own wheat, for example. Experiments which have been promising, so that it can be free from being dependent on foreign food aid. And I think this kind of thing, the West doesn't like that. And that's all this thing you're seeing, the devastation of war that you're seeing in Ethiopia now, is because of this. Because in the new Horn of Africa that is emerging, even in Somalia, this away from war, away from this vicious cycle of conflicts, if these countries begin to cooperate and begin to depend on their own resources to feed themselves. Ethiopia, for example, it has huge potential of agriculture. If it starts to harness, like the GERD, the new Renaissance dam that it has done, it will provide electricity for 45 million of its population. So industrialization will begin to take place. Ethiopia can become an economic powerhouse of the region. And if this kind of thing takes all over Africa, spreads in West Africa and Cote d'Ivoire, if Nigeria becomes free from corruption and begins really to develop itself and becomes an economic powerhouse, well, the West will not like that. That's why you see all these wars in the Horn of Africa. At the end of the day, the explanation of it is they're using the West, the United States and the Europeans are using Tplf to destabilize the whole region, to prevent it from emerging, from ensuring genuine economic development, from being free from foreign aid, from dependency, and embarking on the path of real economic development, which is what? Agricultural, food security, self-sufficiency, agro-industry, and then industrialization. Once this kind of thing takes place all over Africa, it's game over for imperialism, for neocolonialism. On top of that, China is also expanding in its engagement with Africa, which is, I view it as very positive. It is unlike that of the West, which has for the past 60 years of neocolonialism kept Africa under poverty. China, if managed properly, it's a win-win situation for both African countries and for China itself. And China is emerging as a global economic power. So under such circumstances, we witness then these sanctions, economic warfare, war by proxy imposed, and this devastation that Aster has enumerated. I mean, the devastation of war has been tremendous. It will take years, of course. But what is the option for Ethiopia? To go back to the days of the dark days of Tplf, minority rule? No Ethiopian will accept that. That is impossible. The Tplf is hell-bent in saying "Après nous le déluge," as they say in French, right?
Yes.
If we cannot rule, we will destroy Ethiopia. They have openly said this. Their spokesman, Getachew Reda, is on record saying, we will go to the depth of hell to destroy Ethiopia if we cannot go back to power in Addis Ababa. So you see this vindictive group, terrorist group Tplf, unleashing massive destruction in Amhara region, in Afar region, destroying infrastructure, hospitals, schools, industries, factories, and what have you. That is the Tplf. And it is this notorious, destructive group that is being supported by the West to prevent the new Horn of Africa from emerging. The era of peace and cooperation and development from finally emerging in the Horn of Africa. You have to remember, the Horn of Africa has been the most conflict and war devastated region for the past 80 years in Africa. We have been having these vicious cycles of conflict that are constantly pushed by Western powers. Once we say no more, enough, and a new era of peace and stability and cooperation begins, the sky is the limit for our development. And this example then will be replicated elsewhere in Africa. So you see what you see now, these sanctions, economic warfare, destabilization, attempts at human rights intervention, and what have you. But the peoples of our region have had enough. They are saying no more. I think that the new movement, Pan-Africanist movement that has begun in the Horn of Africa, and Ethiopia and Eritrea now, is spreading elsewhere. No more is becoming a Pan-Africanist movement. People are saying in Mali, pas plus, right? That's how we say no more in French. Am I correct? Is it pas
Yes.
plus? Yeah. No more. We're fed up, tired of neocolonialism. We will no longer become, impoverished, and we want to free ourselves. We want to develop ourselves. That's what
Yes.
Africa is saying. I think this is the new vision that the new generation, young generation of
Yes.
Africans must take up as a rallying cry. A new period of Pan-Africanist renaissance and resurgence, I think, in my opinion.
Oui, donc Niki, avant que tu ne traduises, je voulais juste dire à Elias et à Aster qu'on a une question justement sur le panafricanisme, sur la diplomatie de l'africanisme d'un côté et le travail que font le peuple panafricain de l'autre. D'où cette émission que nous sommes en train de faire aujourd'hui. Parce que l'Afrique de l'Ouest a souvent été coupée de l'Afrique de l'Est à cause de la langue, du français d'un côté, de l'anglais de l'autre. Et aujourd'hui, la génération nouvelle, les jeunes générations ne veulent plus être coupées. D'où l'émission qu'on fait ce soir, qui sont traduites dans 2 langues pour que l'Afrique tout entière comprenne. L'émission, elle est longue, elle est vraiment très longue, mais vraiment, Aster, je vous demande encore pardon. Elias, je vous demande pardon. Elle est longue, on a consacré la soirée à cette émission. Justement, ça pour faire le lien entre l'Afrique de l'Ouest et l'Afrique de l'Est. C'est très important. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle l'émission est longue. Niki,
Oui.
après la traduction de ce que vient de dire Elias, tu me laisseras lire 2 contextes concernant la Côte d'Ivoire avant d'entamer le No More,
Okay.
hashtag No More. D'accord?
I translate very briefly that she's saying, we're very sorry, Aster and Elias, that this is taking such a long time because of the translation, but she thinks it's very, very important that the 2 parts of the continent speak to each other, because they've always been cut away because of the language barrier. And that for her has, so she says, sorry for the time that it's taking, that we just have another 2 last questions, and she will read something briefly. I will just translate what Elias's answer. So I'm also I think I'm losing all my paper, so I don't have any more paper. So where did I put the what is happening here? I've lost my I'm so sorry. I think I have, don't know where, I can basically, well, I don't know why I've lost my notes because totally, oof. I've never done a translation like this online, and so I have lost my notes.
It happens. You've been jotting down the translation notes, I guess.
Yeah, I've been writing down what you're saying, and no, but I think what was very important is first of all is I don't know if la régie peut montrer le livre qu'on a sur l'Érythrée, que on avait les images de l'Érythrée.
Oui, 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 il va le mettre. Tu peux traduire. Il va le...
Oui, je trouve plus la traduction, je vous assure. It disappeared. I don't know what happened.
Mais tu fais une phrase ou deux, comme ça, moi je vais.
But I remember, so basically, well, je vais dire donc, pratiquement l'Érythrée a réussi à faire une indépendance, à acquérir son indépendance complètement seul. Donc c'était vraiment, c'est un pays qui a lutté seul parce que ils étaient laissés à eux. Et non, j'ai perdu mes notes. Désolée.
Alors, donc, le temps que je te laisse chercher, je voulais juste revenir un peu sur la situation de la Côte d'Ivoire. Il y a beaucoup de similitudes avec l'Érythrée, il y a des particularités. Mais parce que en 2011, par exemple, la Côte d'Ivoire a subi des sanctions de la CEDEAO, de l'UEMOA, c'est tous les pays africains de l'Afrique de l'Ouest qui utilisent le franc CFA, encore une colonisation monétaire. Et la Côte d'Ivoire a subi depuis 2011 des sanctions de la CEDEAO, de l'UEMOA, de la France, de l'Union européenne et des Nations unies, ce qui a créé un gouffre financier en ce qui concerne la gestion du pays sous la présidence de Laurent Gbagbo. En plus des sanctions financières, l'embargo aux frontières. Je ne sais pas si en Érythrée, en Éthiopie, Tigré, il y a eu un embargo, mais en Côte d'Ivoire, il y a eu un embargo aux frontières, il y a eu un embargo dans les ports, dans les aéroports. Ça a massivement contribué à l'augmentation de décès. Par exemple, dans les hôpitaux, il manquait des médicaments qui ne rentraient plus en Côte d'Ivoire. Aussi, le bombardement du palais de la présidence, le palais du président Gbagbo, les bombardements des camps militaires où les militaires ivoiriens pouvaient protéger la population ont été bombardés. Des universités ont été bombardées. Il y a eu des massacres dans plusieurs villages. Tout le côté ouest et le côté sud, il y a eu des massacres, des villages qui ont été brûlés la nuit. Tous les habitants de ces villages sont morts. Donc, on parle d'environ 40 000 morts depuis 2002 en Côte d'Ivoire et plus de 16 000 entre 2010 et 2011. Donc, la question qui a été posée, où on a vu les images de l'Éthiopie avec le massacre des animaux, des hommes, du matériel et des universités, ça correspond à ce qui s'est passé aussi en Côte d'Ivoire. C'est pour ça que je voulais revenir là-dessus. Et aussi, en Côte d'Ivoire, sous la gouvernance du président Gbagbo, Gbagbo était quand même le bouc émissaire de la France. C'était le pays à déstabiliser dans la zone à cause de l'autonomie et de sa gestion financière dénommée gestion avec le budget sécurisé. C'est-à-dire, Gbagbo ne voulait plus faire des emprunts dans les agences du FMI et de la Banque mondiale. Gbagbo a travaillé dans le pays pendant plusieurs années avec que les recettes propres du pays, c'est-à-dire que les impôts qu'on prélevait. Le président Gbagbo, il avait décidé de ne plus emprunter de l'argent de l'étranger. Donc, tout ça a conduit à l'Union européenne et à la France surtout à mettre des sanctions, les sanctions dont je parlais plus haut. Et par rapport à cela, je ne sais pas si le Tigré et l'Éthiopie a eu aussi des embargos. Ça, je ne sais pas. Est-ce que Elias pourra juste nous parler en quelques minutes de savoir si l'Éthiopie a eu un embargo, par exemple, économique, sur les médicaments, sur les ports, sur toutes les frontières, juste en quelques mots, et après on passe à la partie de la résistance qui a été faite sur le côté mondial avec le mouvement #NoMore, le mouvement qui était effectif pour la mobilisation contre la guerre en Éthiopie. Voilà, je voulais juste savoir s'il y avait eu des embargos en Éthiopie, et après on parle du mouvement mondial NoMore, la guerre en Éthiopie. Tu peux lui traduire juste ça.
Mais il faut que je traduise la question.
Juste lui demander s'il y a eu un embargo sur l'Éthiopie.
Je peux te répondre qu'il y a eu plutôt sur l'Érythrée. Donc,
Voilà.
donc
Ou
the big
l'Érythrée.
the question from the francophone coming in questions is how was Ethiopia and Eritrea, how were they sanctioned by the UN or in general by the, I mean, I know Eritrea much worse than Ethiopia because Eritrea basically everything was sanctioned,
Yes.
right? If you could say 2 words about the sanctions that were suffered by Eritrea and Ethiopia in this last war.
Juste en quelques minutes. Hein.
Well, yeah, essentially, it's a means of pressuring the governments, trying to give the Tplf to breathe life into it. The Tplf essentially was dead, but they're trying to resurrect it from the dead. And so they're putting all kinds of pressure on Ethiopia and Eritrea. They could not do it through the UN this time around because, as I mentioned earlier, the Russians and the Chinese have blocked them. So they're doing unilateral sanctions. For example, in the United States has done it against Eritrea, and it's now doing it also. The beginnings of it we are seeing against Ethiopia. To some degree, the European Union countries are threatening or have been threatening against Ethiopia, but more so against Eritrea. Eritrea has been demonized for decades, so it is not a new thing to us. We have as our president Isaias Afwerki says, the population now has built an immunity against it, knows how to resist this. It doesn't mean it will not hurt us. Of course, it's economic warfare, it will hurt us, but we've kind of gotten used to it and are developing alternative means through self-reliance to escape the pressures of it. Of course, other global powers are also emerging with whom we can trade, with whom we can do economic cooperation. China is a good example. China, for example, now has signed up good cooperation with Eritrea. The Belt Road Initiative, and Eritrea has become a strategic partner of China. Of course, China has invested also heavily in Ethiopia. So there are alternative sources that are emerging. A multipolar world is emerging. Unipolarity is over. The day that one single hegemon ruling after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the past 3 decades have been like that. But I think that is slowly in decline, and a new multipolar world is emerging. In this situation, there are many possibilities, but we have to continue resisting. A luta continua, as they say. The struggle has to continue. The struggle continues. We cannot go back to the old days of Tplf destabilization and what have you. Neither in Ethiopia, nor in Eritrea, nor in Somalia, the whole population of the Horn of Africa has rejected the imposition of the Tplf on them. They are saying no more, we have had enough, we will choose our own leaders. You cannot impose leaders for us from Washington, from Brussels, from Paris, from London. We will decide our destiny and our own fate. We will cooperate with each other. We don't want to fight with each other. Enough of war is what the people are saying in the Horn of Africa. So essentially, I think it's game over for not only for Tplf, but game over for neocolonialism, I think, in the new Horn of Africa.
Yes. Donc, je traduis que pratiquement, bon, les sanctions, heureusement, ceux des Nations Unies ont été stoppés, comme on avait discuté, parce qu'il y a quand même la Russie et la Chine qui ont stoppé les sanctions des Nations Unies. Il y a eu quand même des sanctions unilatérales de la part des Nations Unies vis-à-vis de l'Éthiopie, mais encore pire vis-à-vis de l'Érythrée. Parce que vraiment, ils ont beaucoup sanctionné, carrément tout le gouvernement, aussi toutes les industries, leur moyens de paiement, et vraiment, ils ont beaucoup sanctionné l'Érythrée. Mais comme c'est un pays qui est très habitué déjà à vivre parce qu'ils ont fait une très longue lutte d'indépendance et ils dépendent que d'eux-mêmes, ils sont vraiment habitués à ce genre de sanctions et d'être complètement, de dépendre complètement de leurs propres ressources. Mais ils se sont aussi ouverts maintenant à la Chine avec l'initiative Belt Road Initiative. Donc, ça, et aussi d'avoir des sources alternatives d'échange. Et ça, c'est intéressant parce que c'est vraiment un monde multipolaire qui va naître au lieu d'avoir cette monde des dernières 3 décennies qu'on a vu après l'écroulement de l'Union soviétique, où on voit vraiment, où on a vu l'hégémonie totale des États-Unis ou quand même de l'Occident. Et par contre, Elias Amare prévoit quand même que ce monde-là est en train de s'écrouler et qu'on va plutôt vers un monde de coopération
Très bien.
Aller au-delà vraiment du colonialisme.
OK. Donc,
je dois juste encore traduire l'autre bout, mais où je peux dire en 2 mots juste que voilà, que l'Éthiopie, si la régie peut montrer le livre de l'Érythrée, qu'on avait des images magnifiques pour montrer vraiment qu'est-ce que c'était cette indépendance, si la régie est là, cette indépendance de la part de l'Érythrée, parce que vraiment c'est une chose exceptionnelle de voir ces images qui nous donnent une idée de la difficulté des années de lutte contre ce qui a été vraiment d'abord contre le régime. Est-ce que Narcisse est là ou non?
Non, mais de toutes les façons,
La 12e TV, la diaspora.
nous revenons sur notre chaîne de NTV dans l'émission Tamery. Donc, voilà, on peut embrayer sur le mouvement No More, le mouvement, il peut en parler, l'impact et après le mot de fin à Elias et à Aster.
Just 2 more questions then, if maybe you want to speak about the No More movement and its effective mobilization. Just one example, which I thought was quite extraordinary, is that the Ethiopian diaspora in Virginia, US, recently voted in a Republican candidate in protest against the Biden administration. Diplomacy towards Ethiopian crisis. I don't know if you could tell us something about this No More movement and what it has achieved. Please, Aster.
And as I said before, I think the Ethiopian government, when the conflict started in November 2020, the Ethiopian government was not prepared to retaliate at the campaign that was extensively.
I really cannot hear you, Aster. I don't know. There is a really strong voice. There is like an echo. I can't hear you.
Okay, let me start again. Now I can hear me.
A little bit better.
Now?
Is your battery dying out?
No.
It is fully charged?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't have any problem with the battery.
Is there maybe a telephone?
You don't listen me at all?
There is static noise in the background as you speak.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is.
Maybe there's a telephone nearby?
But I have not touched it up to now.
No, but you have to maybe turn it off, maybe? I don't know.
No.
Okay. No. Okay. Okay. I think it's gone away now.
Now, do you hear me?
Much better.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What I was trying to say is that in the struggle to contain the extensive propaganda that was launched by the Tplf regarding the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian people in general, I think the most important role was played by the Ethiopian diaspora. And in relation to this, I think the No More movement has had a significant role. And it's because of the No More movement that we have seen some kind of change at the international level regarding the image of Ethiopia. And it has helped also to show the political nature of Tplf and to expose the criminal activities and the crimes that it has committed, especially in the Afar and Amhara region. Hence, the No More movement has been important. I hope it will continue, but I'm very skeptical because the political situation in Ethiopia, I think, is not very favorable for the continuing of the No More movement.
Ok, donc le mouvement de No More a été un mouvement incroyable, beaucoup soutenu par vraiment, c'était vraiment soutenu par la diaspora qui a fait vraiment des manifestations qui allaient de tout, de Washington à vraiment, c'était à Rome, partout, il y avait vraiment des manifestations énormes qui ont soutenu qui étaient soutenus vraiment par la diaspora, ce mouvement-là, et qui ont vraiment contrasté ce qui était la propagande qu'ils ont dû subir. Mais voilà, et le seul problème, c'est ils ont vraiment montré toutes les activités criminelles qu'on ne montrait pas du Tplf, et on doit dire que vraiment aussi dénoncer beaucoup le rôle des médias. Mais Aster nous dit qu'elle est un peu sceptique parce que la situation en ce moment ne va pas bien dans le pays, et elle est un peu sceptique est-ce que ça va vraiment pouvoir continuer cette hashtag No More, parce qu'en ce moment on ne comprend pas pourquoi voilà, on ne pousse pas vraiment pour une continuation dans cet élan-là. Donc on a peur peut-être d'en retomber en quelque sorte du régime, peut-être dans les vieux schémas, ça on ne peut pas savoir. And maybe for Elias Amare, I maybe ask you, what steps should be taken to reinforce a Pan-African diplomacy?
I think the basis has to be the grassroots. It has to be a people's movement from the bottom up, not imposed from top down. Real Pan-Africanism must be Pan-Africanism of the African peoples, whether they are in Cote d'Ivoire, in Mali, in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in Zimbabwe. A new resurgence of this No More movement has great potential, I think, in pushing the leaders to be more assertive, to defend the sovereignties of African nations, and to start afresh. In this regard, the recent African Union meeting, the 35th session that was recently held in Addis Ababa, passed important resolutions against these unilateral sanctions that are imposed on African countries. This is unprecedented. For example, it was not done when Eritrea was sanctioned or when Libya was being invaded in 2011. So this is a new beginning, a tentative steps. And I think this grassroots movement, people connecting from east to west, and also the global diaspora, African diaspora, let's not forget. We have a huge population in the West, whether it's from West Africa, from East Africa, that are now citizens in the West. So the No More movement, for example, galvanized Ethiopian and Eritrean voters in the United States. I mean, they're citizens, American citizens, but originally from Eritrea or Ethiopia, and they came together, voted as a bloc, to prevent, for example, the Democrats from winning in Virginia. It made a significant difference, I can tell you that. The margin by which the Democrats lost in the governorship race last a few months ago was 80,000. And combined together, Eritreans and Ethiopian voters in Virginia make up over 100,000. So they rallied, and that made a difference. And we can do it in these upcoming elections, in November, in midterm elections. It is the Democrats now who are becoming warmongers. The Democrats occupying the White House and the State Department. This, what I would call the liberal imperialists or neoliberals or what have you. Left, right, oftentimes does not make much sense to me in the United States. It's a duopoly. They're essentially the same side. There's two sides of the same coin. But we have to stand up. We have to say you cannot devastate our ancestral homelands with these terrible wars and economic warfare and sanction. And we can do it. We have proven we can do it. If we organize, if we mobilize, massive demonstrations, and as a result of this mobilization, also movement, popular movement is growing. Other African diaspora immigrants can join. I think we need to talk to each other, learn from each other's experience, and make sure that this popular grassroots movement spreads all over Africa, because it is resonating with the young generation of Africans. They are tired. I can feel it. I hear them on the social media, what they're speaking, what they're saying. They're sharing experiences, and they're raising this rallying cry: enough of neocolonialism. And I think it is doable. I am more of an optimist in that regard. I echo the sentiment once echoed by Antonio Gramsci. I learned this from Edward Said, the great Palestinian activist. He was quoting Gramsci, and he said, "By intellect, I am pessimist. By the will, I am optimist." Okay, so we have to be pessimist by the intellect, but optimist by the will. Yes, we see there are a lot of problems. There are obstacles and impediments. Intellectually, when we analyze situation, oftentimes it leads us to pessimism or skepticism. But I must caution my sister Aster. We have to be also, as people engage in the struggle, we have to be by the will optimists to see that another world is possible. That a better world can be ushered in, and through struggle, there is a way forward. I think it is not a dead end. It's not completely lost cause, but the potential for change is there in Africa, and it is this kind of exchange of ideas between East and West, between North and South Africa, that will, usher in a resurgence of Pan-Africanism spirit that was there in the 1960s by the founding fathers like Kwame Nkrumah, like Julius Nyerere, the visionary leaders, Frantz Fanon. The new generation of Africans must reread Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, especially that chapter 3, Pitfalls of Nationalism, what it talks about the dangers of tribalism, of ethnic division, sectarian division, that neocolonialism tries to play to divide us. Divide and conquer is the name of the game for the imperialists, for the neocolonials. So we must be united. We must narrow down the sectarian ethnic divides that there are. These are superficial. They are artificial, actually. And imagine a new Africa, a new Pan-African spirit, I think.
Yes, we're just a bit worried. I mean, I am, when I see that maybe they're not defending now why is the Abiy government not defending the Afara and Amara regions with militarily, because the people are currently being massacred. That is not very clear, and so maybe my
answer to that is very simple. Remember, the Tplf regime was brought down by massive popular uprising in Ethiopia, beginning by young people in 2015. Many people lost their lives, of course, thousands, but eventually the unthinkable happened and the Tplf regime crumpled like dust in 2018. So governments have to be pushed by popular mobilization from below. And, we can do it. It has been done before. It can be done again.
Actually, I would like to discuss the internal political situation in Ethiopia because it is so complicated. We don't have the problem of Tplf only, as you know, my brother. We have also other forces like OLF Shene. In these days, a number of people are dying around Ethiopia. Just recently, a number of people are being killed in the region of Oromia, and that's not the responsibility of Tplf. That's the responsibility of OLF Shene. The situation in Ethiopia is getting much more complicated. It's not easy. We cannot simply accuse the Tplf. The ethnic politics in Ethiopia is creating a devastating situation, actually. 2 days ago, around 30 people were killed in Oromia. Every day we hear that people are being massacred in Oromia. And this is an ethnically based killings. And this has been going on for the last 3-4 years. We cannot hide anymore the situation in Ethiopia. The internal factors, the internal contradictions of Ethiopia are going to affect even the diplomatic activity and even the no more movement. If you see now, the Ethiopian diaspora is no more participating in the no more movement. And that's because there are some political factors, internal political factors that are hindering the movement to go ahead. The situation, I think it might take, I don't know, 2-3 hours to discuss the political situation in Ethiopia now. It's getting worse and worse every day.
That's why I think we should have another program. This was mainly one to introduce to our West African public the possibility to understand who the actors are, what has happened, how the implications were in the West. And I also want to be optimistic. I can feel it that this is going to be definitely the liberation, the century of Africa's liberation, I'm sure. Because I can feel what's happening in West Africa. The youth has understood. I totally agree with Elias Amare that it's over. It's just going to take this last push. But at the same time, we also have to not forget what is happening on a daily basis, and also be ready to criticize if something is.
Excuse me, Nicoleta. The question in Ethiopia now, it has become a question of survival. The situation now is a question of survival for the Afar and the Amhara people. Yes. The war has not stopped. The war is going on in the Afar region. People are dying there. People are being displaced. The same thing is happening in the Amhara region, especially in the territories of Raya. People are being killed every day in Oromia. We hear, every day we hear that 30-40 people are killed, especially in Oromia, especially in the province of Wallagga. And this is the situation in Ethiopia now. And the government doesn't take any kind of decision. The armed forces are ordered not to retaliate to Tplf. In fact, the government has declared that there is no conflict in Ethiopia, but the conflict is going on, and people are dying, and people are being displaced. So it's a question of survival.
Yeah. What would be the best thing that we could do now, considering that we have so far sort of been very positive and optimist about the Abiy Ahmed government? What would be the best thing to do to start denouncing these what would you say?
Ethiopians have started denouncing yesterday. I don't know, you have seen the video. I've
Yesterday
seen
in
the
Washington.
video. The
In Washington, there was a huge...
Afars and the Amharas have been demonstrating yesterday in front of the State Department. And they were condemning openly the government of Abiy Ahmed. Things are changing.
What do you think, Elias? What can we do?
As Esther said, I'm not denying the internal contradictions are so complex. The 3 decades of the legacy of the Tplf is not going to be healed overnight. It will take time. These are, I believe, the last gasps of a dying regime or its legacy. The toxic legacy of ethnic politics will take some time to completely heal. And I think this Ethiopia is a very big, complex country facing complex problems. But I think the potential is there once the Tplf is completely gone from the scene for a new beginning, a new imagination. I'm hopeful, for example, of the upcoming national dialogue. If a genuine national dialogue of reconciliation starts, the people can come up with solutions. And I think from all corners of Ethiopia, there is fatigue from this toxic ethnic politics. They want a new kind of beginning. What that new kind is going to be, I think, will be decided in the future. So the struggle has to intensify. I agree the problems facing the country are not simple. They're very complex problems. We cannot deny that. But imaginative solutions are also possible. Governments usually have to be pushed to bring about change. Fundamental change always happen from bottom up, from grassroots movements, popular mobilization. I think that in the next stage, that kind of a popular mobilization is much needed. Yes, people are suffering in Afar and Amhara. The war has not been over yet. I mean, still fighting remains to be done. The pressure from the West is there. But I don't think the Tplf can come back to power. And I don't think the toxic ethnic politics of the Tplf has, the Ethiopian people do not have stomach for it. They want a new dispensation, respect, mutual respect, of course, plurality, but democratic beginnings are in the offing. I mean, I may be too optimistic, but that's how I feel. That's how I see it from Eritrea. But then again, in internal Ethiopian matters, I acknowledge that my sister Esther could be more knowledgeable than me. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but what option do I have but to be optimistic for the new beginning?
Thanks.
And I think that's a very nice...
Let's be optimistic.
I like that. Je vais traduire, donc...
Let's finish it with optimism.
Yes.
And say, a luta continua, the struggle continues.
La lucha
continua.
Mes amis français, on va terminer la émission ici. Je vais juste traduire les dernières questions qu'on a dit, les derniers 2 mots qu'on a dit. Et donc on avait juste abordé le fait qu'il y a en ce moment quand même des exactions qui continuent et c'est pas nécessairement que le Tplf, mais aussi par exemple le OLF qui est dans certaines régions. Donc justement, Aster posait la question, mais comment c'est possible que le gouvernement ne protège pas les 2 régions? et qu'on fait semblant que c'est que le Tplf. Il y a aussi d'autres, voilà, un groupe, des miliciens Oromo qui sont en train d'attaquer les Amaras en particulier. Et donc, il faut aussi parler de tout ça. Le fait que le président actuel n'en parle pas, c'est assez grave. Par contre, Elias Amare, qui vient de l'Érythrée, qui a quand même 70 ans d'une lutte incroyable qu'ils ont fait pour l'indépendance et pour la souveraineté. On va traduire après mieux ce qu'il nous a dit. Donc lui, il nous cite les mots magnifiques de Antonio Gramsci qui disait voilà qu'il faut être pessimiste dans l'intellect, mais quand même optimiste dans la volonté. Et avec ces mots-là, mes amis, on va vous laisser. C'était vraiment une magnifique soirée. Je vous remercie beaucoup de nous avoir écoutés. On va faire une traduction plus précise peut-être de certains morceaux parce que ça a été très improvisé. Et je vous remercie beaucoup pour l'attention.
Ok, donc je voulais rajouter que c'est vrai que c'est vrai, je voulais aussi dire que la soirée a été longue. On a voulu consacrer vraiment beaucoup de temps à l'histoire de l'Éthiopie, de l'Érythrée et du Tigré, parce que les gens de l'ouest de l'Afrique n'ont pas d'infos là-dessus et c'est pour ça que la soirée a été très longue. Moi, je remercie nos invités, Elias Amare et Aster. Je vous remercie beaucoup d'avoir participé, d'avoir pris le temps de participer à cette émission. Et cette émission vraiment a pour but de faire le lien entre l'Afrique de l'Ouest et l'Afrique de l'Est. Et la jeunesse le demande, la jeunesse africaine toute réunie le demande. Maintenant, ils sont ensemble. Et donc, nous, on prend le parti de vraiment relier ces deux parties, sans oublier aussi les pays comme le Burundi, le Rwanda, le Swahili et tous ces pays-là. Et donc, on aura des émissions maintenant comme ça. C'est long parce que c'est en deux langues. Il y a la traduction, il y a les thèmes. Donc, je vous remercie beaucoup d'avoir consacré toute la journée pour Elias et tout l'après-midi, toute la soirée pour Aster. Et donc, sur 2NTV, dans l'émission Tamery, on vous remercie et on espère vous revoir et à très bientôt.
We hope to see you soon again, and we know the youth. The youth really wants a lot to hear these type of programs, and so we really thank you, and we hope you'll be coming back soon.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I think it's a good night. I don't know for Elias. What time is it over there? Elias, what time is it over there?
We will continue the discussion. I'm glad we had this discussion.
It will be very interesting.
Very interesting
Merci
indeed.
encore. Merci
beaucoup. Grazie. Thank you.
Grazie mille.
Bye bye. Ciao.